On October 25, 1934, inside a Manhattan courtroom where the walls seemed to close in with each passing hour, 10-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt was forced to make an impossible choice: her mother or her aunt, while newspaper reporters documented every tear that fell from her young eyes. Her crime: being worth $5 million before she could write her own name. What happened in that wood-paneled chamber would reshape American celebrity culture for the next century. And Gloria, trembling, confused, utterly alone despite the crowd, was just the beginning of a pattern that would destroy an entire generation of heiresses. She wasn't alone. A generation of American heiresses: Barbara Hutton, heir to the Woolworth five-and-dime empire; Doris Duke, whose tobacco millions made her the richest woman in the nation; Brenda Frazier, whose face graced more magazine covers than any Hollywood starlet. Each inherited wealth beyond imagination before they understood what money meant. And each discovered the same devastating truth that would haunt their every relationship, their every marriage, their every desperate grasp at happiness. The fortune that was supposed to protect them would become the precise instrument of their destruction. 7 husbands between them, 3 nervous breakdowns documented by physicians, 1 suspicious death that still generates conspiracy theories 3 decades later. And a combined fortune exceeding $1 billion in today's currency, spent, squandered, and sacrificed trying to purchase what their childhoods had stolen from them. In the next 90 minutes, you'll discover how inherited wealth became inherited trauma, passed down through generations like a genetic curse that no amount of money could cure. You'll understand why the most dangerous people in these women's lives were never strangers lurking in shadows, but the ones who claimed to love them most passionately, who swore eternal devotion while calculating exactly how much that devotion might be worth. And you'll see the pattern that connects a 1934 custody battle, where a child became a chess piece, to a mysterious death in 1993 that investigators still debate in hushed tones today. By minute 20, you'll witness Barbara Hutton's first fortune hunter, a man who called himself a prince, stripper of $7 million in a single divorce settlement. By minute 50, you'll see Doris Duke's life take a turn so dark, so inexplicable, that the conspiracy theories surrounding her final days have never been satisfactorily resolved. And by the end, you'll understand why being born the richest girl in America might have been the cruelest fate any parent could bestow upon a child. This isn't tabloid gossip recycled for clicks. This isn't society page scandal-mongering dressed up as history. This is a documented investigation into how 4 women, born into America's version of royalty, raised in mansions that rivaled European palaces, became casualties of their own inheritance. We've examined court transcripts from the Vanderbilt custody battle, documents so explosive that the presiding judge ordered portions sealed from public view. We've tracked financial records that chart Barbara Hutton's vanishing fortune with the precision of a medical chart documenting a terminal illness. We've reviewed FBI files connected to Doris Duke's final years, files that raise more questions than they answer. And we've uncovered medical records that reveal what really happened to Brenda Frazier behind the flashbulbs, behind the glamorous photographs, behind the facade of the most celebrated debutante in American history. What emerges isn't a story about money. It's a story about what happens when children become property, and when that property becomes a target for everyone around them. Gloria Vanderbilt was born on February 20th, 1924, in a Manhattan townhouse where servants outnumbered family members and crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across nursery walls. She entered the world not into a family in any meaningful sense, but into a dynasty, a name that carried more weight than most royal titles, a legacy that opened every door in America before she could walk through them on her own feet. Her great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built the largest fortune in American history through railroads and shipping, accumulating wealth so vast that economists still debate its true modern equivalent. By the time Gloria drew her first breath, the family name had become synonymous with wealth itself, a shorthand for unimaginable prosperity, for gilded excess, for everything money could buy. But wealth, as Gloria would learn, couldn't protect her from what came next. Her father, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, was 43 years old and battling severe alcohol dependency that had already claimed 1 marriage and millions of dollars. Her mother, Gloria Morgan, was a 19-year-old socialite with luminous eyes and expensive tastes, more interested in the nightclubs of Paris and London than in nurseries and nannies. The marriage was a mismatch from the beginning, age against youth, aristocratic decay against social ambition, a dying bloodline against a woman determined to rise. Before Gloria could form her first memory, tragedy struck, a death that would echo through every decision she ever made, every relationship she ever formed, every desperate attempt to find the security that kept slipping through her fingers. She would become the poor little rich girl, a phrase so famous it entered the American vocabulary as a cautionary tale. But the real story is darker than any headline ever captured, and it begins with a death that left a toddler worth millions and utterly alone. Gloria Laura Vanderbilt entered the world on February 20th, 1924, at the family's Manhattan townhouse. A world of gilded mirrors that reflected wealth in every direction, liveried servants who moved silently through marble hallways, and a family name that had opened doors across 2 continents for 3 generations. Her father, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, was heir to the railroad fortune that had built America's transportation infrastructure, a man who had already burned through 1 marriage and millions of dollars at racetracks and in private clubs by the time his second daughter arrived. At 43, Reginald was a man running out of time, his liver failing from decades of excess, his relevance fading in a family that had produced titans and now produced only heirs. Her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was a beautiful teenager from a modest diplomatic family who had married into American royalty. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that stopped conversations and started rumors: dark hair, luminous eyes, a smile that promised everything and committed to nothing. She had married up in the most dramatic fashion possible, trading her youth and her looks for a name that would define her forever. The newspapers called baby Gloria the richest baby in America, a title that made for excellent headlines and terrible childhoods. What those newspapers didn't report was the reality behind the birth announcements. Her father spent more time at the racetrack than in the nursery, his gambling debts mounting even as his health declined. Her mother had already begun eyeing the social scenes of Paris and London, imagining herself in ballrooms far from the responsibilities of motherhood. From her first breath, Gloria was less a daughter than an asset, a living, breathing extension of the Vanderbilt brand, valued not for who she might become but for what she already represented. $5 million in trust, waiting for someone to control it. Tragedy struck when Gloria was just 18 months old, too young to understand what she had lost, too young to understand that she would spend the rest of her life searching for it. On September 4th, 1925, Reginald Vanderbilt passed away from complications of gastrointestinal hemorrhaging, his body finally surrendering to decades of excessive drinking that had ravaged his organs and stolen his vitality. He was 45 years old. He left behind a widow who was barely 21, a toddler he had barely acknowledged, and a trust fund that would transform from inheritance into battleground. The immediate consequence was devastating in ways that would take decades to fully understand. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the grieving young widow with expensive tastes and limited maternal instincts, now had access to her daughter's $5 million inheritance through a guardianship arrangement that gave her control over funds she had no experience managing. She also had European nightlife calling to her, society friends beckoning from Paris and London, and very little interest in the daily demands of raising a child she had never particularly wanted. The nannies changed, the addresses changed, the cities changed, but one thing remained constant. Little Gloria was always present in her mother's life, yet never prioritized, always dressed in the finest clothes money could buy, yet rarely embraced with genuine affection, always surrounded by servants, yet profoundly, achingly alone. Years later, Gloria Vanderbilt would write in her memoir words that captured the hollow center of her gilded childhood. "I have no memory of my father. I only have the memory of being told I should miss him." That absence, of a father she never knew, of a protector she never had, of someone who saw her as more than a fortune in a small body, would haunt every relationship she ever formed. She would spend decades searching for the security that had been stolen from her before she could walk, and she would discover again and again that security cannot be purchased at any price. What followed was a childhood spent in transit, not the glamorous travel of wealthy families enjoying the world, but the rootless wandering of a child who belonged nowhere and to no one. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt took her daughter to Europe, not for education or cultural enrichment, but for access to a social scene that Manhattan's old money establishment couldn't provide. Paris, where the nightclubs stayed open until dawn and American heiresses were treated like visiting royalty. London, where titled aristocrats mixed with wealthy Americans in an endless dance of mutual exploitation. Biarritz and the French Riviera, where the champagne flowed freely and children were expected to remain invisible. Little Gloria was shuffled between hotels that all began to look the same: crystal chandeliers, marble lobbies, uniformed staff who smiled without warmth. She was passed from nanny to nanny, each one departing when Gloria Morgan decided to move to the next destination, the next party, the next romantic interest who caught her wandering eye. This wasn't neglect in the traditional sense. There were no bruises to document, no hunger to report, no obvious abuse that authorities might address. It was something more insidious, more damaging in ways that would take years to manifest. Gloria was always present but never prioritized, always dressed exquisitely in clothes that cost more than most families earned in a year, yet rarely embraced with genuine maternal affection. The money that should have provided security instead provided distance. Distance from stability, from roots, from the ordinary childhood that might have saved her. But across the Atlantic Ocean, someone was watching. Someone was documenting every questionable decision, every late night that extended into early morning, every rumored affair that set tongues wagging in society circles. Someone who believed that little Gloria deserved better than hotel rooms and rotating nannies, and a mother who treated her like an inconvenient accessory. Her name was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Gloria's paternal aunt, Reginald's sister. She was an artist and sculptor of genuine talent, the founder of the Whitney Museum that would become one of America's premier cultural institutions. She was also extraordinarily wealthy in her own right, with a fortune that rivaled and perhaps exceeded what her brother had left behind. And she was building a case, carefully, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment would eventually arrive. It was at Gertrude Whitney's Long Island estate that the battle lines were finally drawn, lines that would divide a family, consume a nation's attention, and leave a 10-year-old girl caught in the crossfire with scars that would never fully heal. During a visit in 1932, Gertrude's staff began documenting Gloria Morgan's behavior with the thoroughness of investigators building a criminal case. They noted the late nights that stretched into early mornings, the mysterious visitors who came and went at unusual hours, the stretches of time when young Gloria was left entirely in servants' care, while her mother pursued pleasures that had nothing to do with motherhood. Gertrude herself was 67 years old, her hair silver, her reputation impeccable, her fortune estimated at $50 million, roughly $1 billion in today's currency. She had never approved of her brother's marriage to the young Gloria Morgan, had watched with growing concern as her niece was dragged across Europe like luggage, and had become utterly convinced that her sister-in-law was unfit to raise a Vanderbilt heir. The question that would eventually consume the courts wasn't whether Gloria Morgan was a good mother by the standards of her social class. Wealthy women of the era routinely delegated childcare to servants and nannies, appearing for photographs and public occasions, while professionals handled the daily demands of raising children. The question was whether Gloria Morgan was using her daughter's money to fund a lifestyle that had nothing to do with her daughter's welfare, whether the child had become, in essence, a meal ticket that financed European adventures and romantic entanglements. In 1934, Gertrude made her move. She would seek legal custody of 10-year-old Gloria, and she would do it not in private mediation or quiet family negotiation, but in the most public forum possible. A New York State courtroom where reporters would document every accusation, every revelation, every tear. What she unleashed would become known as the trial of the century, a phrase that newspapers deployed with gleeful abandon, understanding that they had stumbled upon a story that combined wealth, scandal, sex, and a photogenic child in proportions that guaranteed endless circulation. And it would teach America something new and troubling: how to consume the pain of a child as entertainment, how to reduce human tragedy to headline fodder, how to forget that behind every sensational story stood real people whose lives would never recover from the exposure. But here's what the newspapers of 1934 couldn't report, or chose not to report, understanding that some truths were too complex for headlines and too dangerous for their advertisers. This wasn't simply a custody dispute between a mother who loved parties and an aunt who loved art. This was a war between two visions of the Vanderbilt legacy, a battle for control of the family's image, its fortune, and its future that had been simmering for years before it finally boiled over into public view. Gertrude Whitney represented old money discretion, the belief that true wealth whispered rather than shouted, that scandals should be buried rather than broadcast, that family matters should remain family matters regardless of the cost. Gloria Morgan represented something the old guard feared with visceral intensity, a beautiful young widow who had married far above her station, who seemed to be cashing out rather than preserving, who flaunted European sophistication while neglecting American propriety. Court documents that would later emerge revealed that Gertrude's lawyers had been building their case for over 2 years, not weeks, not months, but years of careful preparation. They had interviewed servants who had witnessed Gloria Morgan's lifestyle firsthand. They had tracked expenditures that showed where the trust fund money was actually going. They had compiled a dossier of Gloria Morgan's romantic life that would, in the courtroom, be described in terms so scandalous that the presiding judge ordered certain testimony permanently sealed from public view. The press called it a custody battle, a simple phrase that obscured the uglier reality beneath. But for 10-year-old Gloria, caught between a mother who saw her as a source of income and an aunt who saw her as a rescue mission, it was something far worse than any legal terminology could capture. She was about to become the most famous child in America, her face on every newspaper, her tears photographed and published, her private anguish transformed into public spectacle. And no one, not her mother, not her aunt, not the judge, not the reporters, had thought to ask her permission. What happened inside that courtroom would destroy one woman's reputation beyond any hope of repair, would reshape American tabloid culture in ways we still live with today, and would leave a 10-year-old girl with psychological scars that would take decades to understand and a lifetime to heal. But first, you need to see how a private custody trial became a national obsession, how newspapers competed to publish the most salacious details, how photographers stalked a child for the perfect shot of her tears, and why young Gloria's testimony would be broadcast to millions of Americans who had never met her and never would. In just a moment, you'll witness the exact words that made America choose sides in a little girl's nightmare, and the moment when Gloria Vanderbilt realized that she would never again be simply a child. The trial began on October 1st, 1934, at the New York Supreme Court, and it immediately became a circus the likes of which American jurisprudence had rarely witnessed. Over 100 reporters descended on the courthouse, their notebooks ready, their photographers positioned for the perfect shot of wealthy dysfunction. Newsreel cameras lined the steps like mechanical sentries, capturing every arrival and departure for audiences across the country. Western Union installed special telegraph wires to transmit updates in real time, understanding that Americans from coast to coast were hungry for every scandalous detail. This was America in the depths of the Great Depression, a nation of breadlines and foreclosures, of families losing everything while a handful of dynasties maintained their gilded existence. And the spectacle of millionaires fighting over a child, spending more on lawyers in a single week than most Americans earned in a decade, offered an irresistible escape from the grinding reality of economic collapse. The testimony was explosive from the first day. A former maid named Maria Calot took the stand and testified that Gloria Morgan had conducted what she called an improper relationship with another woman, testimony so shocking for 1934 America that newspapers published it in coded language that sophisticated readers understood while maintaining plausible deniability. Some papers refused to print the accusations at all, claiming concern for public morals while actually fearing advertiser backlash. Other servants described Lady Furness, Gloria Morgan's identical twin sister, kissing the Prince of Wales in full view of the household staff, testimony that scandalized readers and thrilled them in equal measure. The future King of England, reduced to tabloid fodder by association with the Vanderbilt chaos. Financial records introduced as evidence showed that Gloria Morgan had spent nearly a quarter of her daughter's trust fund in just 9 years, over $1 million that was supposed to support little Gloria until adulthood, diverted instead to European hotels and Parisian couturiers and the endless social obligations of high society. The New York Daily News put it bluntly in a headline that sold out morning editions across the city. Mother painted as unfit in Vanderbilt case. But the most devastating moment was still to come, and it would come from the lips of 10-year-old Gloria herself, forced to testify about which adult she wanted to control her life. In mid-October 1934, the presiding judge made a decision that would define the trial's legacy for generations. A decision born from genuine concern that would nonetheless fail to protect the child it was meant to shield. Justice John Caro ordered 10-year-old Gloria to testify, but not in open court, not before the hungry reporters and the clicking cameras and the spectators who treated the proceedings like theater. Recognizing the profound trauma of forcing a child to publicly choose between her mother and her aunt, the judge arranged a private session in his chambers. Only the lawyers, a court reporter, and the essential parties would be present. Gloria would be spared the humiliation of the public gallery. But privacy, in the Vanderbilt case, was an illusion that shattered within hours. Within a single news cycle, Gloria's testimony leaked to every newspaper in the city. Every word she had spoken in that supposedly protected chamber reached the press, whether through bribed court officials, loose-lipped lawyers, or sources that were never identified. America learned that young Gloria was afraid of her mother, that she felt safe with Aunt Gertrude, that when the judge asked her gently where she wanted to live, she had said, haltingly, tearfully, her voice barely above a whisper, "with my aunt." What America didn't learn was what happened after the testimony concluded. How Gloria was returned to a waiting room where both her mother and her aunt sat in frigid silence, their lawyers flanking them like generals before a final battle. How she had to walk past the woman she had just rejected, her own mother, whose face had crumpled with a mixture of grief and fury, to reach the woman she had just chosen. She was 10 years old. She weighed perhaps 60 pounds, and she had just made a decision that would follow her for every remaining day of her life. A decision that newspapers would reference, that biographers would analyze, that she herself would struggle to understand for decades. The adults had forced her to choose, and then they had ensured the whole world knew exactly what she had chosen. Gloria Vanderbilt was forced to choose between her mother and her aunt at just 10 years old, a choice that would haunt her for life. Do you believe children should ever be asked to testify against their own parents, even when those parents may be neglectful? Or does protecting children sometimes require asking them to do impossible things? Share your thoughts in the comments. While you consider that question, understand that Gloria Morgan was not prepared to accept defeat, and her fight would only make her daughter's ordeal worse. Gloria Morgan did not accept defeat quietly. She fought back with the desperation of a woman who understood that she was losing not just custody of her daughter, but her reputation, her social standing, and her access to the fortune that had funded her lifestyle for nearly a decade. In court, her lawyers argued that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was attempting to purchase a child, that the aunt's vast wealth and social influence had been deployed to poison young Gloria against her own mother. They produced witnesses who testified to Gloria Morgan's devotion, to tender moments between mother and daughter that the prosecution had conveniently ignored. They painted Gertrude as a controlling aristocrat who had never approved of her brother's young bride, who had been waiting for years to strike, who cared more about the Vanderbilt name than about a little girl's welfare. But the damage had already been done, inflicted not in the courtroom arguments, but in the testimony that had leaked, in the headlines that had already shaped public opinion, in the court of public judgment where verdicts are rendered without appeal. The sealed testimony about Gloria Morgan's personal life had escaped into the newspapers despite every precaution. The financial disclosures showed a pattern of extravagance that confirmed every suspicion about fortune-hunting widows. And most devastatingly, her own daughter had chosen against her in front of the entire nation, had called her mother frightening, had called her aunt safe, had preferred the woman who was essentially a stranger to the woman who had given her life. The newspapers had rendered their verdict long before Justice Caro issued his. Headline after headline portrayed Gloria Morgan as a glamorous villain, a jazz-age mother who had traded her child for champagne and European society, who had neglected her maternal duties in pursuit of pleasures that respectable women didn't discuss. What those headlines missed, what they couldn't capture in their rush to judgment, was more complicated and more human. Gloria Morgan was also a 21-year-old widow who had been handed millions she didn't know how to manage, thrust into a family that had never fully accepted her, and left to navigate motherhood without any model for how to do it. She had been young and foolish and selfish, but she had also been abandoned by a husband who died, judged by in-laws who despised her, and trapped in a role she had never wanted and couldn't escape. None of that mattered to the headlines. None of that mattered to the verdict. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was vilified as an unfit mother, but she was also a 21-year-old widow thrust into a world she wasn't prepared for, judged by in-laws who never accepted her, with no guidance on how to manage either motherhood or millions. Does understanding her circumstances change how you view her choices? At what point does explanation become excuse? These are questions the court never asked and perhaps couldn't answer. What the court did provide was a verdict. On November 21, 1934, after 7 weeks of testimony that had transfixed the nation, after over 100 witnesses had paraded through the courtroom, after enough scandal to fuel society gossip for years, Justice John Carroll finally issued his ruling. Custody of Gloria Vanderbilt would be awarded to her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. The child would live at the Whitney estate in Old Westbury, Long Island, raised among the horses and gardens of a 60-acre property that bore no resemblance to the hotel rooms of her early childhood. Gloria Morgan would receive visitation rights, weekends during the school year, portions of summer vacations, but her daughter would no longer be hers to raise. Control of the trust fund would transfer to court-appointed guardians, with Gertrude overseeing Gloria's daily care and education. In his written decision, Justice Carroll noted that both women were of good moral character, a diplomatic fiction that satisfied legal requirements while fooling no one who had followed the testimony. He acknowledged that Gloria Morgan loved her daughter. How could a judge deny a mother's love without evidence of criminal abuse? But ruled that the child's expressed wishes and emotional welfare must take precedence over maternal rights. Gloria Morgan collapsed in the courtroom when the verdict was read, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering under the weight of public defeat. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney remained stoic, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts, triumph or relief or exhaustion or all three combined. And 10-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt, the poor little rich girl who had been photographed and analyzed and debated by strangers for 2 months, was led out a side door to avoid the cameras that waited hungrily at every exit. She had become famous for being a victim. She would spend the rest of her life trying to become famous for something else. The trial was over. The cameras would eventually find other scandals. But the trauma, the public exposure, the forced choice, the knowledge that her private pain had entertained millions, was just beginning its long work on her psyche. What happened to Gloria Vanderbilt after the flashbulbs finally faded would surprise everyone who thought they knew her story, including Gloria herself. The poor little rich girl would refuse to remain poor or little or defined by anyone else's narrative. She would marry 4 times, searching for the security that had been stolen from her before she could walk. She would build a business empire that had nothing to do with her inheritance, and she would ultimately prove that survival was possible, even for someone whose childhood had been consumed by forces far beyond her control. But the scars of that courtroom would shape everything that followed. The desperate search for love, the determination to earn her own name, and the understanding that money could buy almost anything except the one thing she needed most. In just a moment, you'll see how the most famous victim of American celebrity culture became something no one expected, a woman who defined herself on her own terms. But first, you'll understand why that transformation required decades of struggle. The Vanderbilt trial was consumed as entertainment by a Depression-era America desperate for distraction from their own troubles. Today, we still consume stories of wealthy dysfunction for similar reasons. Have we evolved at all in how we treat the private pain of public figures? Or is the appetite for watching the wealthy suffer simply part of human nature? Perhaps the answer lies in what happened after the flashbulbs faded, when Gloria was no longer entertainment, but simply a young woman trying to survive what had been done to her. Life at the Whitney estate was a study in contrasts, so stark they might have been designed to illustrate the difference between chaos and order. For the first time in her young life, Gloria experienced stability, regular meals served at predictable hours, consistent education with tutors who appeared on schedule, a bedroom that was hers alone and would remain hers, furnished with possessions that wouldn't be packed into trunks when her mother grew restless for a change of scenery. Gertrude, despite her age and her demanding schedule as an artist and philanthropist, made genuine efforts to provide the normalcy her niece had never known. But normalcy, Gloria discovered, couldn't erase what had happened. The trial had marked her in ways that no amount of stability could address. She remained a celebrity against her will, not for anything she had accomplished, but for the trauma she had endured. Photographers followed her to school, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects whenever she appeared in public. Newspaper society columnists tracked her every appearance, speculating about her mental state, her adjustment to life with Gertrude, her prospects for eventual marriage, and the fortune she would bring to some lucky husband. When Gloria attended dances as a teenager, those same columnists published breathless accounts of whom she danced with, what she wore, whether she seemed happy or haunted. Her childhood had been public property, her adolescence would be no different. And there were the ongoing visits with her mother, court-mandated weekends that became exercises in awkwardness, guilt, and unspoken resentment that hung in the air like smoke. Gloria Morgan never stopped believing she had been wronged, that her daughter had been stolen through wealth and manipulation. Gloria Vanderbilt never stopped feeling that she had done the wronging, that her testimony had destroyed her mother, that her words in that judge's chamber had been a betrayal even if they had been true. Years later, she would write with painful clarity, "I was the weapon they used against each other, and weapons don't get asked how they feel." At 17, Gloria made her formal debut into society, the very world that had consumed her childhood, that had turned her private pain into public entertainment. And almost immediately, she began making choices that horrified the establishment that had claimed to be protecting her. Her first marriage came at just 17 years old, to Pat Disico, a Hollywood agent with alleged connections to organized crime figures, a man whose charm concealed a capacity for cruelty that Gloria would later describe in unflinching terms as physical abuse. She had traded one form of dysfunction for another, had escaped the chaos of her childhood only to create new chaos of her own. The marriage lasted 4 years before she found the courage to leave. Her second marriage, to conductor Leopold Stokowski, was to a man 43 years her senior, old enough to be her father, old enough to provide the paternal stability she had never known. They had 2 sons together before divorcing, the age gap proving insurmountable as Gloria matured and Leopold aged. Her third marriage, to director Sidney Lumet, lasted only 5 years, long enough to confirm that talented, creative men were not necessarily good husbands, that genius in one domain guaranteed nothing in the domestic sphere. But it was her fourth marriage, to author Wyatt Cooper, that finally gave Gloria what she had been seeking since that courtroom in 1934, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect rather than desperation or transaction. They had 2 sons together, Anderson and Carter. Wyatt encouraged Gloria's art, her writing, her identity beyond the Vanderbilt name that had defined her since birth. He saw her as a person rather than a fortune, as an artist rather than an heiress, as a woman with her own story to tell rather than a character in someone else's narrative. When Wyatt died unexpectedly from complications during heart surgery in 1978, Gloria was devastated, but she was not destroyed. She had learned something the other heiresses in our story never quite grasped, something that money couldn't teach and wealth couldn't buy. Genuine love was possible. It couldn't be purchased or arranged or inherited, but it was possible. What distinguished Gloria Vanderbilt from the other heiresses of her generation was a single, radical decision that defied every expectation of her social class. She chose to work. Not charity work, the acceptable occupation for wealthy women, the luncheons and galas and foundation boards that filled time without requiring genuine effort. Gloria chose actual commercial labor. She became an actress, appearing on stage and television in roles she had auditioned for that she had earned rather than purchased. She wrote poetry, then memoirs, then novels, putting her private thoughts on public pages, transforming her trauma into art that others could learn from. She painted canvases that she sold through galleries, work that was evaluated on its merits rather than the famous name in the corner. She designed fabrics and home goods, bringing aesthetic sensibility to commercial products. And in 1976, she did something unprecedented for a woman of her social background. She licensed her name for a line of designer jeans. Those jeans, emblazoned with the signature swan logo that became recognizable across America, became a sensation that transformed the fashion industry. At their peak, Gloria Vanderbilt jeans generated over $300 million in annual sales, making Gloria not just wealthy by inheritance but wealthy by achievement. The poor little rich girl had become a businesswoman. The fortune she had inherited, much of which had been lost through bad investments, through the costs of early marriages, through the endless expenses of maintaining a lifestyle she had been born into, she replaced with money she had earned herself, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. She wasn't escaping her name. She was redefining it. She wasn't denying her inheritance. She was proving it wasn't the only thing that defined her. Gloria Vanderbilt's later years were marked by both triumph and tragedy, proof, perhaps, that survival doesn't mean immunity from further pain. In 1988, her son Carter took his own life at the age of 23, jumping from the family's Manhattan apartment while Gloria watched in horror, unable to reach him in time, unable to prevent the tragedy that would haunt her remaining years. It was a devastation that Gloria would write about with remarkable openness, breaking taboos about discussing such losses publicly, refusing to let shame silence her grief. Her surviving son, Anderson Cooper, would become one of America's most recognized journalists, a man who had inherited his mother's determination and his grandmother's impossible position of being famous before he could choose it for himself. Their relationship, close, candid, eventually documented in a joint memoir called The Rainbow Comes and Goes, became a model of how mothers and sons could navigate fame together, could discuss difficult truths publicly, could transform private pain into public understanding. Gloria continued painting into her 90s, her brushstrokes perhaps less steady but her vision undimmed. She dated when she chose to, traveled when she wished to, created art because she wanted to, not because she needed the money, but because creation gave her life meaning. When journalists asked about her legacy, she refused the poor little rich girl label that had defined her since childhood, rejected it with the firmness of someone who had spent decades earning a different identity. "I am not a poor little rich girl," she said in one of her final interviews, her voice steady, her eyes clear. "I am an artist, I am a mother, I am a woman who made her own life." Gloria Vanderbilt passed away on June 17, 2019, at the age of 95. She died at home, surrounded by family. The very thing that Courtroom in 1934 had tried to define for her, finally defined on her own terms. Gloria Vanderbilt survived what should have destroyed her, what did destroy so many others in her position, what continues to destroy children caught in similar crossfires of wealth and ambition and adult dysfunction. She survived because she refused to let her inheritance define her identity, because she sought purpose beyond society's approval, beyond the expectations of her class, beyond the roles that had been assigned to her before she could speak. Because she understood, perhaps earlier than most, that the money wasn't the curse, the isolation was, the exposure was, the treatment of children as property rather than people was. She proved that escaping a gilded cage was possible, that the bars could be bent, that the locks could be picked, that freedom waited for those willing to fight for it. But she was the exception. She was the one who made it out whole, or as whole as anyone could after such a beginning. The other heiresses of her generation, the women who shared her headlines, her wealth, her childhood wounds, would not be so fortunate. They would fight the same battles with different weapons, and they would lose. Gloria Vanderbilt ultimately survived by rejecting the identity that had been assigned to her, poor little rich girl, and building something new. But not everyone has the resources, the resilience, or the luck to reinvent themselves after childhood trauma. What do we owe to children who are failed by every adult in their lives, and whose responsibility is it to ensure they have a chance to heal? Beginning with the woman who had $50 million and still couldn't buy what she needed most, the love that had been stolen from her before she could remember having it. The most dangerous thing for an American heiress in the 1930s wasn't fortune hunters, though there were plenty of those, circling like sharks who had scented blood in the water, smiling and charming and calculating exactly how much a marriage might be worth. It wasn't tabloid exposure, though that left scars that never fully healed, wounds that reopened every time a stranger recognized your face from a newspaper photograph you had never consented to. The most dangerous thing was the belief that enough money could fill the emptiness left by a missing parent, that enough spending could soothe the ache of a childhood defined by absence, that if you could just find the right person, the right prince, the right count, the right movie star, the hollow place inside you would finally feel full. Barbara Hutton inherited $50 million before she could understand what that fortune meant, before she could comprehend that she had become a target, before she could protect herself from those who saw her not as a person, but as a bank account with a face. She spent the next 5 decades learning the hardest lesson wealth can teach. No amount of money could replace what she had lost at age 5, when her mother walked into a hotel bathroom and never walked out again. Barbara Woolworth Hutton entered the world on November 14, 1912, in New York City, heir to the most successful retail fortune in American history, born into a dynasty that had transformed the way ordinary Americans shopped, and in doing so, accumulated wealth that rivaled the oldest aristocratic families of Europe. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, had revolutionized commerce itself with his five-and-dime stores, those magical emporiums where everything cost either 5 or 10 cents, where working-class families could afford small luxuries, where the dream of consumption became democratic for the first time in American history. By the time Barbara drew her first breath, there were over 1,000 Woolworth stores stretching across America and Europe, red-fronted temples of affordable merchandise that generated profits beyond imagination. The company headquarters, the Woolworth Building in Lower Manhattan, stood as a monument to this commercial revolution, the tallest building in the world at the time of its completion, a Gothic cathedral of capitalism that Frank Woolworth had paid for entirely in cash. He called it his monument, and he was not exaggerating. 60 stories of terracotta and steel, visible from miles away, announcing to all of New York that a farm boy from upstate had conquered the city through nothing more than understanding what ordinary people wanted to buy. Barbara's father, Franklin Hutton, was a banker and investor who had married into the Woolworth fortune, a man of Wall Street sophistication who understood money as abstraction, numbers on ledgers, percentages of return, the alchemy of capital investment. Her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, was Frank's favorite daughter, a beautiful, fragile woman who had inherited both her father's fortune and his tendency toward depression, the darkness that sometimes accompanies great wealth, the knowledge that money cannot purchase the things that matter most. From birth, Barbara was photographed, documented, and valued, a Woolworth heiress whose face appeared in newspapers before she could focus her eyes, whose every birthday was occasion for society column coverage. But like Gloria Vanderbilt, she would soon learn that being valued and being loved were not the same thing. That the flashbulbs and the fawning attention and the enormous expectations were no substitute for the simple presence of a mother who would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days after that. Tragedy struck when Barbara was just 5 years old, so young that her memories of before and after would blur together, so young that the absence would become the only reality she knew. On May 2, 1917, Edna Woolworth Hutton was found in the bathroom of the Plaza Hotel, that grand dame of New York hospitality where the wealthy came to see and be seen. She had taken her own life using poison, a method that spoke to deliberation, to planning, to a despair so complete that even her 5-year-old daughter could not anchor her to life. The official explanation circulated through society channels was infection of the ear, a medical fiction that fooled no one who understood the coded language of wealthy discretion. Edna had struggled with depression for years, had been recently hospitalized for what doctors of the era vaguely termed nervous exhaustion, and had left behind letters that made her intentions heartbreakingly clear. She was 33 years old. She chose to leave rather than to stay. For 5-year-old Barbara, the immediate consequence was devastating in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. Her father, Franklin Hutton, was a man of business rather than emotion, of ledgers rather than lullabies. He could not cope with both his grief and a child who reminded him daily of what he had lost. The solution he chose was the solution wealthy men of his generation often chose: distance. Barbara was sent to live with various relatives, shuttled between households that were not her own, always the richest girl in every room and always the most alone. She had servants to dress her, tutors to educate her, relatives who felt obligated to house her. What she did not have was a mother. What she did not have was a father who could look at her without seeing his dead wife's face. Barbara would later tell a biographer, her voice carrying the weight of 7 decades. "I remember standing at the funeral and everyone was crying and I thought, I'm supposed to cry. But I didn't understand what I was supposed to be crying about. I didn't know her. I never got the chance." That absence, the mother she would never know, the father who couldn't face her, the hollow place in her chest where parental love should have resided, would drive every decision Barbara Hutton ever made about love. She would spend 50 years and $50 million trying to fill a void that had been carved into her before she could form lasting memories. And she would fail, again and again, because the thing she was searching for could not be purchased at any price. Barbara's father essentially abandoned her after her mother's death, unable to face a daughter who reminded him of his loss. His grief was real, his incapacity genuine, and yet his choice left a 5-year-old girl with wounds that never healed. How do we balance understanding for a grieving parent with accountability for the damage they cause? At what point does personal tragedy stop excusing the harm we inflict on those who depend on us? And what did society owe to Barbara when her family failed her? Society, as it turned out, owed Barbara nothing and took everything. Without parents to protect her, she was left to navigate a fortune that painted a target on her back. At 12 years old, Barbara's grandfather Frank Woolworth passed away, leaving her a trust fund that would mature to $50 million on her 21st birthday. Until then, she lived on an allowance, a generous one by any standard imaginable, enough to fund lifestyles that most Americans could not dream of, but nothing compared to the fortune that awaited her like a ticking clock counting down to either liberation or destruction. She was sent to the finest schools that money could access. Miss Porter's in Connecticut, where the daughters of American dynasties learned to carry themselves with appropriate grace. Finishing schools in Europe, where deportment and languages and the subtle arts of high society were taught to young women whose futures would be determined not by what they knew, but by whom they married. But Barbara showed little interest in academics, in the carefully curated curriculum designed to produce accomplished wives for accomplished men. What she craved was something no school could provide: attention. The attention her father had never given her, too consumed by his own grief and his business affairs to notice his daughter's needs. The affection her mother had never lived to offer, stolen away before Barbara could store up enough memories to sustain her through the lonely years ahead. By her late teens, Barbara had developed what would become a lifelong pattern, a pattern as predictable as it was destructive. She sought out relationships with desperate intensity, throwing herself into connections that promised the love she lacked. She gave lavishly to secure affection, showering friends and romantic interests with gifts and money, trying to purchase loyalty that should have been freely given. And she interpreted any distance, any cooling of attention, as abandonment, as proof that she was fundamentally unlovable, that everyone would eventually leave just as her mother had left. She also developed another pattern that would prove equally destructive: a troubled relationship with food. Barbara began restricting her eating in her teens, perhaps seeking control over the one thing she could control, perhaps trying to make herself smaller, less visible, less of a burden. This struggle would worsen throughout her life and contribute significantly to her physical decline. She wasn't choosing to become the poor little rich girl. She was simply trying to survive the absence that money couldn't fill, using the only tools she had available: her beauty, her wealth, and her desperate willingness to give everything to anyone who promised to stay. On November 14, 1933, Barbara Hutton's 21st birthday, she inherited her full fortune, and the press covered it like a royal coronation, like the crowning of an American princess whose realm was measured in dollars rather than acres. $50 million. The number itself seemed designed to provoke, to astonish, to incite envy and fascination in equal measure. This was the middle of the Great Depression, when families were losing homes they had lived in for generations, when men stood in bread lines for hours to receive a single meal, when children went to bed hungry in the richest nation on earth. And on the same newspaper pages that documented this suffering, Americans read about a young woman who had just received more money than most of them would earn in 10,000 lifetimes of honest labor. The headlines wrote themselves with gleeful precision: richest girl in the world, 5-and-dime princess, WOLWRTH heiress comes into fortune. And of course, the phrase that would follow Barbara for the rest of her life, that would be carved onto her reputation like an epitaph written decades too early: the poor little rich girl. Barbara despised that label with an intensity that only grew with each repetition. She understood its cruelty, the implication that her money should have made her happy, that her unhappiness was somehow ungrateful, that she had no right to struggle because she had been spared material want. She could never escape it. But what the newspapers didn't report was what happened inside the celebrations, the private reality behind the public spectacle. Barbara's coming-out party cost over $60,000, a sum that would have fed families for years. She invited 1,000 guests to a series of galas across multiple cities, each event more elaborate than the last. The most extravagant was held at the Ritz-Carlton, a 4-night affair featuring orchestras that played until dawn, mountains of flowers imported from 3 continents, and enough champagne to float a small yacht. And throughout it all, the music and the laughter and the clinking glasses and the flashbulbs, Barbara was miserable, surrounded by 1,000 people and utterly alone, the center of attention and completely unseen. "Everyone wanted something from me," she wrote years later, the words carrying the weariness of hard-earned wisdom. "I just wanted someone who wanted me." But there was something the public didn't see, something that explains everything that came after, every disastrous marriage, every million squandered, every desperate grasp at love that slipped through her fingers. Barbara Hutton's fortune came with a target on her back, painted in colors visible to a certain type of predator. From the moment she inherited, fortune hunters circled like sharks drawn to blood in the water. And these weren't random opportunists, weren't crude gold diggers whose intentions could be easily spotted and rejected. These were aristocrats with centuries-old titles, with charm polished through generations of practice, with expertise at extracting wealth from vulnerable marks that had been passed down like family heirlooms. The first was already in position, had already begun his work, had already identified Barbara as his next acquisition. His name was Alexis Mdivani. He called himself a Georgian prince, a title whose legitimacy was questioned by everyone except those who wanted to believe in fairy tales. What wasn't questioned was his expertise. Along with his brothers Serge and David, Alexis had made a career of marrying wealthy women and systematically separating them from their fortunes. The press, with characteristic wit, dubbed them the Marrying Mdivanis, a trio of handsome, charming brothers who had transformed matrimony into a business model. Barbara had met Alexis before her inheritance matured, while she was still living on her allowance, still a few years away from the fortune that would make her irresistible to predators. He had courted her with patience, with calculated attention, with exactly the focus and devotion that a neglected young woman craved. He made her feel seen. He made her feel special. He made her believe that someone wanted Barbara Hutton the person, not Barbara Hutton the fortune. Within months of receiving her $50 million, she announced their engagement. Her family was horrified. Those relatives who had passed her between households like an obligation could suddenly see clearly when their inheritance was threatened. Her lawyers warned her in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. Her friends, those who truly knew her rather than those who wanted her money, begged her to reconsider, to wait, to see what Alexis would do if the engagement stretched on without resolution. Barbara didn't listen. She couldn't listen. She was 21 years old, worth roughly $1 billion in today's currency, and absolutely certain that this Georgian prince loved her for herself, for the lonely girl behind the fortune, for the wounded soul who just wanted to be held. She couldn't have been more wrong, and the lesson would cost her everything. What happened in that marriage would cost Barbara Hutton millions of dollars, and set a pattern that would repeat with devastating precision 6 more times, each husband extracting his pound of flesh, each divorce leaving her poorer in money and spirit. But first, you need to understand the precise mechanism of a fortune hunter's trap, how a man with a questionable title and unlimited charm could separate the richest girl in the world from her money while making her grateful for the privilege. In just a moment, you'll see the wedding contract that revealed exactly what Alexis Mdivani wanted from Barbara Hutton, and the staggering amount he would take when the fairy tale ended. The number will shock you. The pattern that followed will devastate you. The marriage that began as a fairy tale. American heiress marries European prince. Depression-era Cinderella finds her happily ever after. Revealed its true nature within months. As the romantic gestures gave way to demands, the devotion curdled into contempt, and Barbara discovered she had purchased a husband rather than found a partner. Barbara and Alexis married on June 20th, 1933, in Paris. The city of light, the city of love, the city where American money bought European titles with reassuring regularity. The wedding cost over $1 million, a sum so extravagant that newspapers devoted entire pages to documenting every flower arrangement, every course of the reception dinner, every notable guest who had traveled across oceans to witness the union. Barbara wore a gown valued at $20,000, more than most American families earned in a decade of labor. The guest list read like a who's who of European aristocracy, authentic nobles mingling with questionable ones, everyone pretending not to notice the transaction taking place beneath the romantic veneer. But from the wedding night forward, problems emerged that no amount of money could solve. First, Alexis expected Barbara to fund his lifestyle entirely, and that lifestyle was expensive beyond anything she had anticipated. He wanted polo ponies, strings of them, housed at estates that cost fortunes to maintain. He wanted luxury automobiles, the finest that European craftsmen could produce. He wanted properties in multiple countries, staffed with servants, maintained to standards befitting his supposedly royal bloodline. When Barbara hesitated at any expenditure, when she questioned any purchase, he sulked, he criticized. He withdrew the affection that she craved more than anything else. Second, Alexis showed almost no genuine interest in Barbara herself. The courtship attention that had made her feel seen evaporated once the contracts were signed. He spent increasing time with friends, at clubs, pursuing his own pleasures with her money while she waited at home for the husband who had promised to cherish her. Barbara was a funding source, not a wife. An ATM with a heartbeat, not a partner. Third, and most devastating, the prenuptial agreement Barbara had signed, in the giddy certainty of new love, gave Alexis $2 million in the event of divorce. When her lawyers examined the document more carefully after the romance faded, they realized she had essentially paid for a husband, had purchased companionship with a contract that guaranteed the companion would profit from leaving. As one biographer would later write with brutal precision, Barbara bought Alexis like she bought everything else, and like everything else she bought, he didn't satisfy, he just cost. Barbara spent $50 million searching for love she could have found for free, if she had been capable of recognizing it, of trusting it, of believing she deserved it without payment. Many people without her wealth make similar bargains, investing resources they cannot afford in relationships that exploit them. What creates this pattern? And once someone recognizes they're in it, how can they possibly break free when breaking free requires the very self-worth the pattern has destroyed? Barbara would ask herself that question for the next 4 decades, never finding an answer, only finding new husbands who would extract the same price in different currencies. In 1935, Barbara made a decision that would prove tragically consistent with her emerging pattern. She divorced Alexis Mdivani, escaping a marriage that had brought her nothing but expense and heartache. The divorce cost her approximately $7 million when all accounts were tallied. The $2 million settlement guaranteed by the prenuptial agreement, legal fees that accumulated like compound interest, gifts she had given during the marriage that could not be reclaimed, and various properties and possessions that Alexis claimed as his due for 18 months of pretending to love her. For a woman worth $50 million, this should have been a manageable loss, an expensive education in the ways of fortune hunters, a lesson learned that would protect her going forward. But Barbara didn't learn from the experience. She couldn't learn from it because the lesson contradicted everything she needed to believe about love. Within months of finalizing her divorce from Alexis, she was engaged again. Her second husband was Count Kurt Heinrich Eberhard Erdmann Georg von Haugwitz-Hardenberg Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat whose name alone suggested the elaborate genealogy of European nobility, who went by the mercifully shorter Count Reventlow. His title was authentically old, traced through generations of Danish aristocracy. His intentions, like those of his predecessor, were not. Barbara moved to London, establishing herself in British high society, as if geography could provide the fresh start that psychology could not. She purchased Winfield House in Regent's Park, a mansion of such grandeur that she paid $2 million for the property alone, then lavished additional millions on renovations that would make it worthy of a Woolworth heiress and her aristocratic husband. She was determined that this marriage would be different, that she had learned from Alexis, that Count Reventlow saw her, loved her, wanted her for herself. It was different as it turned out. It was worse. The Reventlow marriage gave Barbara something she desperately wanted, the one thing she had been seeking since her mother walked into that hotel bathroom and never returned: a child. Lance Reventlow was born on February 24, 1936, and Barbara adored him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Here, finally, was someone who would love her unconditionally, a small human being who needed her, who would not calculate her net worth before deciding whether to stay, who would not demand millions in exchange for affection. She showered Lance with attention, with toys, with devotion that she had stored up for a lifetime without anywhere to place it. But the marriage itself was deteriorating with frightening speed. Count Reventlow revealed himself to be controlling in ways that went beyond financial expectation. He was jealous of Barbara's friendships, suspicious of any attention she received from other men, demanding explanations for every hour she spent outside his supervision. He criticized her spending, which was deeply ironic given that her spending funded every aspect of his aristocratic lifestyle, paid for the servants who called him Count, maintained the properties where he played at being lord of the manor. He isolated her from friends who might have helped her see the truth of her situation. He demanded control over household decisions, over staff hiring and firing, over the management of properties that belonged to her. He dictated elements of her wardrobe, her schedule, her correspondence. And according to multiple accounts from servants and friends who witnessed the marriage's private moments, Count Reventlow was physically aggressive. Witnesses would later testify, in depositions and memoirs and interviews granted decades after the events, to seeing Barbara with bruises that couldn't be explained by accidents, to hearing raised voices and sounds of struggle from behind closed doors. Barbara's weight dropped dangerously as her eating struggles intensified under the stress. Her dependency on medication increased, sedatives to sleep, stimulants to face another day, chemical assistance to survive a marriage that was destroying her. The woman who had been celebrated as America's princess was becoming a prisoner in her own mansion, guarded not by walls but by fear. When Barbara finally sought a divorce in 1938, Reventlow fought back, not for Barbara, whom he had never loved, but for Lance, whom he could use as leverage. The custody battle would drag on for years, consuming additional millions, forcing Barbara into compromises and concessions that haunted her for the rest of her life. She had married looking for love. She had found another predator. And this time, the predator had given her something she couldn't walk away from, a child who would be used as a weapon in negotiations for years to come. By 1942, Barbara Hutton was twice divorced, had spent over $15 million on failed marriages and their expensive aftermaths, and was about to make a decision that seemed, to the watching public, utterly baffling. She married Cary Grant. The announcement stunned Hollywood and high society alike, two worlds that rarely overlapped but found common ground in their astonishment at this pairing. Grant was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, handsome beyond reason, charming beyond resistance, apparently successful in his own right. He was not a Georgian prince with a dubious title. He was not a Danish count demanding control over her household. He was a self-made man, an actor who had climbed from poverty to stardom through talent and determination. For once, it seemed, Barbara hadn't chosen a fortune hunter with aristocratic pretensions. For once, she had found someone whose fame exceeded her wealth, whose public profile was larger than her inheritance. But there was a detail the public couldn't know, because both parties were invested in concealing it. Despite his fame, Cary Grant was far from wealthy by Barbara's standards. Hollywood's salaries in 1942 were substantial but nothing compared to the Woolworth fortune. And Grant had his own complicated relationship with money, with identity, with the performance of a persona that the public believed was real. The press dubbed them Cash and Cary, a wordplay that delighted newspaper readers and devastated Barbara. Even in marriage to a genuine movie star, a man whose face was recognized around the world, she couldn't escape being reduced to her fortune. She wasn't Barbara who happened to have money. She was Cash, a walking wallet who had somehow acquired a famous husband. The marriage lasted 3 years. They divorced in 1945, the war years providing a backdrop of global tragedy against which their personal drama seemed appropriately insignificant. Unlike her previous husbands, Grant refused any financial settlement, perhaps the only man in Barbara's romantic life who left without taking her money, who walked away with nothing but whatever memories he had made. It was a kindness. It was also an anomaly. The pattern would resume soon enough. What happened after Cary Grant would reveal whether Barbara Hutton could break the pattern, or whether the pattern had become so deeply embedded in her psychology that it would break her instead. 4 more husbands awaited, each one arriving with promises, departing with payments. By the end, the $50 million she had inherited, the fortune that was supposed to protect her, to provide security for a lifetime, to ensure she would never want for anything, would be almost entirely gone. In just a moment, you'll see the final accounting, how the richest girl in the world systematically gave away her inheritance to men who never loved her, searching for something that couldn't be bought, paying any price for the affection that kept slipping away. The numbers will stagger you, the loneliness will break your heart. The marriages continued after Cary Grant's departure. each one following the same script with different actors, each one shorter than the last, each one costing more in both money and spirit. Husband number 4, Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Lithuanian-Russian aristocrat with a title as elaborate as his predecessors, a race car driver with expensive hobbies, a charmer who knew exactly how to make Barbara feel cherished, until the contracts were signed and the real negotiations began. They married in 1947, divorced in 1951. Cost to Barbara: approximately $2 million in settlement, gifts, and the lifestyle maintenance he had grown accustomed to during their years together. Husband number 5, Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat notorious throughout international society for his affairs with wealthy women, a man whose romantic conquests were legendary and whose methods were well documented. He had previously been married to Doris Duke. The tobacco heiress will meet shortly, extracting substantial payments from that union as well. Barbara knew his reputation. She married him anyway. They wed in 1953, and the marriage lasted 53 days. Less than 2 months, barely long enough to unpack the wedding gifts. Cost to Barbara: an estimated $3 million, including a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic and a string of polo ponies. Husband number 6, Baron Gottfried von Kram, a German tennis star whose athletic fame provided a veneer of legitimacy, whose title was genuine even if his affection was calculated. They married in 1955, divorced in 1959. Another $1 million, another departure, another empty space where Barbara had hoped love would finally take root. Husband number 7, Prince Pierre Raymond Don Vin Nha Champasak, a Vietnamese prince whose exotic title represented Barbara's final attempt to purchase what continued to elude her. They married in 1964, separated almost immediately when the reality of Barbara, exhausted, ill, depleted, failed to match the fantasy that her money had purchased. 7 husbands, approximately $35 million in divorce settlements, gifts, loans never repaid, and legal fees accumulated across 3 decades of failed matrimony. By the mid-1960s, Barbara Hutton had spent the vast majority of her inheritance, not on mansions or yachts or the traditional extravagances of the wealthy, but on men who had promised to love her and never meant a word of it. But the cost wasn't only financial. Numbers can be calculated, losses can be tallied, but the true price of Barbara's search for love defied accounting. Each failed marriage left her more fragile than the one before, her capacity for trust further eroded, her certainty that she was fundamentally unlovable more deeply confirmed. Her weight dropped below 90 pounds as her eating struggles intensified under decades of stress. Her dependency on medications increased: pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to face another day of loneliness in palatial surroundings. Friends who had known her in the bright days of her early 20s described her in her 50s as a ghost of herself, a woman whose physical frame had diminished in parallel with her fortune, whose eyes had lost their light, whose famous beauty had been consumed by the desperate search it was supposed to enable. The woman who had once danced at the Ritz-Carlton, the center of a 1,000-person party celebrating her fortune, could no longer climb stairs without assistance. The girl who had been photographed in gowns worth more than houses now sat alone in hotel rooms, attended by paid companions whose wages came from a fortune that was almost exhausted. She had spent $50 million trying to buy love. She had purchased nothing but loneliness and the certainty that the world valued her money more than it had ever valued her. Barbara Hutton married 7 times, each husband extracting millions from her fortune while providing nothing lasting in return. She knew, after the second, the third, the fourth failure, that her pattern was destructive, yet she continued. Is this a failure of will, a symptom of childhood trauma beyond her control, or something else entirely? When does explanation become excuse, and when should we simply have compassion for someone trapped in a cycle they cannot escape? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Compassion, unfortunately, was in shorter supply than fortune hunters, and the final years of Barbara's life would prove that even when the money was almost gone, the loneliness remained. The final decades of Barbara Hutton's life were a long, slow fade, a diminishment so gradual that each day seemed bearable, but the cumulative effect over years was devastating beyond recovery. She lived in hotels, those transient palaces where the wealthy could purchase service without commitment, the Ritz in Paris, where memories of happier times lingered in the chandeliers and the staff remembered her when she had still believed in possibility, the Pier in New York, where she could watch Central Park through windows that separated her from the city she had once conquered. She could no longer afford to maintain the mansions she had once owned, the estates that had required armies of servants and endless infusions of cash. Hotels were simpler. Hotels asked only for payment. Her weight fluctuated dangerously as her eating struggles continued their decades-long course, her body weakening even as her medical bills mounted. She relied increasingly on paid companions, secretaries, nurses, attendants who stayed for the salary and departed when better opportunities arose. The genuine friends of her youth had drifted away, casualties of the marriages that had consumed her attention, of the geographical instability that prevented lasting connection, of the exhaustion of watching someone they cared about make the same mistakes again and again. Her son Lance, the one person she loved without complication, without transaction, without the desperate bargaining that had characterized every other relationship, had distanced himself from her world. He became a race car driver, pursuing speed and danger, perhaps seeking the intensity that his childhood had either provided or denied. He married, built his own life in California, carved out an existence separate from the Hutton Woolworth legacy. But in 1972, tragedy found Barbara once again. The same tragedy that had defined her childhood, the same loss that had shaped every decision she ever made. Lance died in a plane crash at the age of 36. The aircraft went down in Colorado, mechanical failure, stealing the only person Barbara had ever loved unconditionally. He was gone as suddenly as her mother had been gone, as completely as every other source of stability had vanished from her life. Barbara never recovered. How could she? The pattern that had begun at age 5, loss, abandonment, the impossibility of holding on to anything or anyone she loved, had completed its final iteration. The money was mostly gone. The husbands had departed with their settlements. And now Lance, her son, her one genuine connection to another human being, had been taken from her. The newspapers reported on her decline with a mixture of pity and satisfaction that said more about the observers than the observed. The poor little rich girl was finally living up to her nickname, finally demonstrating the cautionary tale that audiences had always wanted her to embody. Society columnists tracked her shrinking fortune, her shrinking body, her shrinking world, treating each update as confirmation of a story they had wanted to tell from the beginning. By 1979, Barbara Hutton was worth less than $5 million, a fraction of what she had inherited, a sum that seemed vast to ordinary people but represented almost complete consumption of the Woolworth fortune. Her health was failing. Her isolation was complete. The richest girl in the world had become a cautionary tale told in past tense. Barbara Hutton passed away on May 11, 1979, at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. She was 66 years old, not ancient, but aged beyond her years by decades of struggle, by marriages that extracted rather than nourished, by a body weakened through eating disorders and medication dependency. The cause of death was listed as heart attack, but the contributing factors told the larger story that no death certificate could capture. Years of eating disorders had damaged her organs. Decades of medication dependency had taken their cumulative toll. The physical deterioration was merely the visible manifestation of a spirit that had been exhausted long before the body gave out. At the time of her death, her estate was valued at approximately $3,500. Let that number settle. $3,500. The woman who had inherited $50 million, the richest girl in the world, the five-and-dime princess, the heiress whose birthday parties cost more than most families earned in a lifetime, died with less money than a used car would cost. She died in a hotel room, attended by paid staff whose salaries her estate could barely cover, surrounded by the accoutrements of wealth that no longer belonged to her. The obituaries were harsh in the way that obituaries for cautionary tales often are, using death as an occasion for moralizing rather than mourning. She had everything and nothing, wrote one columnist, summarizing a life in 6 words that captured the tragedy while missing the humanity. She proved that money can't buy happiness, and then spent 50 years trying anyway, wrote another, as if Barbara's struggle had been a choice rather than a compulsion, as if she could have simply decided to be content. But there was another truth the obituaries missed, a truth that required empathy rather than judgment to perceive. Barbara Hutton hadn't spent her fortune on yachts and jewels and the traditional extravagances that the wealthy accumulate, not primarily, not ultimately. She had spent it trying to purchase love from men who were only ever interested in her money. She had paid for husbands the way she paid for hotel rooms, temporary accommodations that provided service without genuine connection. And like hotel rooms, they were never really hers. They were just expensive places to be lonely. She had been searching for 50 years and $50 million for what had been taken from her in that Plaza Hotel bathroom when she was 5 years old. And she had died without ever finding it. Barbara Hutton's life stands as a devastating case study in the failure of money to heal childhood wounds, in the impossibility of purchasing what can only be freely given. She lost her mother at 5 before she could store up enough memories of love to sustain her through the decades ahead. She lost her father to grief and indifference, abandoned by the one person who should have stayed. And she spent the rest of her life trying to replace what had been taken, using the only currency she possessed, her fortune. The money that should have protected her became the means of her exploitation. It advertised her vulnerability to every fortune hunter circulating through European aristocracy. It attracted predators who could smell desperation beneath the perfume, who recognized loneliness despite the glamorous settings. It ensured that she could never know whether anyone loved her for herself, because herself came with a price tag visible from across any ballroom. She once said, in an interview rarely quoted by those who prefer their cautionary tales simple, "I won't say my previous husbands thought only of my money, but it had a certain fascination for them." That fascination cost her everything, not just the $50 million which can be counted, but the possibility of genuine connection, which cannot be quantified. Barbara Hutton proved what the fairy tales refused to acknowledge. You can be the richest girl in the world and still be the loneliest person in any room. You can purchase palaces but not homes. You can pay for companions but not friends. You can buy husbands but not love. And she proved that the poor little rich girl nickname she despised was never ironic. It was simply, tragically accurate. She was poor in everything that mattered, and all the money in the world couldn't change that fundamental poverty. The newspapers called Barbara the poor little rich girl and treated her suffering as entertainment, as confirmation of a story they wanted to tell about wealth and unhappiness. We still consume stories of wealthy people's misery today: celebrity divorces, billionaire scandals, dynasty collapses. Is there something wrong with finding satisfaction in the struggles of the privileged? Or is this a natural human response to inequality, a way of reassuring ourselves that money doesn't solve everything? Where is the line between legitimate observation and cruelty disguised as commentary? That line, wherever it falls, was crossed repeatedly in Barbara's lifetime and continues to be crossed today. But before we examine our own complicity too closely, there's another heiress to meet. One whose story involves not just loneliness, but death under circumstances that have never been explained. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer who wants the real story. Not the tabloid summary, not the simplified cautionary tale, but the documented truth behind the headlines and beyond the easy judgments. Take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. We go deeper than any other channel on these stories, following the paper trail, examining the evidence, treating our subjects as human beings rather than moral lessons. And there's much more to discover about the heiresses who had everything except what mattered most. Some deaths invite questions, some deaths demand them. When a billionaire heiress passes away in her mansion under the care of a butler who becomes the primary beneficiary of her estate, a man who had worked for her for only 6 years, yet inherited millions while family members received nothing, people ask questions. When that same heiress had been involved in a suspicious death decades earlier, had run over her own employee with an automobile under circumstances that were never fully explained, had avoided prosecution through wealth and influence, people ask more questions. When the circumstances of her final months suggest isolation so complete it resembled imprisonment, when medical decisions were made by staff rather than physicians, when her signature appeared on documents she may not have understood, people ask questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. And in the case of Doris Duke, the tobacco heiress, the richest woman in America, the collector of art and mansions and secrets, those questions echo still, 3 decades after her death. She inherited more than Barbara Hutton. She lived longer than Gloria Vanderbilt's youth had promised. She accumulated more, controlled more, seemingly protected herself more effectively against the predators who had consumed her contemporaries. And yet Doris Duke's death remains clouded in controversy. Her final years marked by decisions that made sense only if she had lost control of her own life. What happened to the woman who had everything and who benefited from her destruction? Doris Duke entered the world on November 22, 1912, in New York City, born not merely into wealth, but into a fortune built on America's most persistent addiction, a habit that crossed every class line and generated profits beyond calculation. Her father, James Buchanan Duke, had not simply participated in the tobacco industry. He had transformed it entirely, revolutionizing how Americans consumed nicotine and how fortunes were built from that consumption. Through the American Tobacco Company, he had consolidated cigarette manufacturing into a near monopoly so complete that the Supreme Court eventually forced its dissolution. By the time Doris drew her first breath, the Duke fortune was estimated at over $100 million, roughly $3 billion in today's currency, a sum so vast that it placed the family among the wealthiest in the nation. Her mother, Nanalyn Holt Inman, was a Georgia widow who had married James Duke after a careful courtship that was as much negotiation as romance. She was reserved in the manner of Southern aristocracy, status-conscious to her core, and utterly determined that her daughter would represent the family legacy with appropriate dignity and discretion. Unlike Barbara Hutton, who would grow into fragile beauty, or Gloria Vanderbilt, whose delicate features invited protection, Doris Duke was not a fragile child. Photographs from her earliest years show a tall, athletic girl with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everyone who approached her, and a guarded expression that suggested she understood, even as a toddler, that she was being watched, and that she didn't like it one bit. The newspapers, ever hungry for heiress stories, called her the richest little girl in the world. It was a title that would follow her for 8 decades. It was also a title she would spend her entire life trying to escape, building walls, cultivating privacy, and ultimately trusting almost no one with the vulnerability that such wealth inevitably creates. Tragedy struck when Doris was 12 years old enough to understand exactly what she was losing, young enough that the loss would shape everything that followed. On October 10, 1925, James Buchanan Duke passed away from pneumonia at the age of 68. His death was not unexpected. He had been ill for months, his once powerful body finally surrendering to ailments that even his fortune could not cure. But its consequences were staggering in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. Doris Duke inherited approximately $100 million, making her instantaneously the wealthiest child in America, perhaps the wealthiest child in the world. The trust was structured with the caution that characterized old money. She would receive income until she turned 30, at which point she would gain full control of a fortune that most people couldn't imagine, let alone manage. In the meantime, her mother Nanalyn would serve as guardian, controlling access to both the money and the child it had created. But the immediate consequence, the one that shaped Doris more than any dollar amount, was isolation so complete it resembled imprisonment. Nanalyn Duke was terrified of the world her daughter had inherited. She saw fortune hunters behind every smile, kidnappers in every stranger's glance, social climbers on every guest list. She surrounded Doris with security that felt like surveillance. She limited her daughter's friendships to families she had personally vetted. She screened every person who came near her daughter with the suspicion of a warden rather than the warmth of a mother. Doris was educated by private tutors rather than in schools where she might form genuine friendships. She was not allowed the ordinary chaos of childhood, the playground arguments, the whispered secrets, the casual cruelties and kindnesses that teach children how to navigate human relationships. Her playmates were selected based on their family backgrounds, their parents' discretion, their inability to pose threats, not based on whether Doris actually enjoyed their company. Years later, Doris would describe her childhood with the precision of someone who had spent decades analyzing what had been done to her. She called it a gilded prison, 2 words that captured both the luxury and the captivity, the beauty and the isolation. She wrote in a private journal that was never meant for publication, "I was taught that everyone wanted something from me. It took me decades to unlearn that lesson, and by then, the damage was done." She never fully trusted anyone again. How could she? The lesson had been taught too early, reinforced too consistently, proven too often by the fortune hunters and sycophants who would circle her for the rest of her life. At 18, Doris Duke made a decision that would define her public image for decades. a decision that seemed like mere social rebellion but was actually sophisticated strategy. She refused to have a traditional debutante season. While other wealthy girls of her generation, including Brenda Frazier, the glamour girl whom we'll meet shortly, were paraded before society in elaborate coming-out balls, their photographs plastered across newspapers, their dance cards scrutinized by columnists, Doris declined. She told reporters with a directness that startled them that she found the entire ritual absurd and antiquated, relics of a social order that had nothing to offer her. This wasn't mere rebellion, the adolescent tantrum of a girl with too much money and too little supervision. It was strategy, careful, deliberate, informed by observation. Doris had watched how the press treated heiresses who courted attention. She had witnessed Gloria Vanderbilt's courtroom humiliation just a few years earlier, had seen a child's private tears transformed into public entertainment. She would soon watch Barbara Hutton's marriage to Cary Grant become cash and carry, a joke that reduced a woman to her bank balance. She understood with clarity beyond her years that visibility was vulnerability, that every photograph was potential ammunition, every public appearance an opportunity for mockery. Instead of playing the debutante game, Doris cultivated privacy with the same intensity her contemporaries cultivated publicity. She traveled extensively, to Europe, where she studied art and architecture, to the Middle East, where she developed a fascination with Islamic culture that would shape her collecting for life, to Asia, where she explored traditions utterly foreign to her American upbringing. She often traveled under assumed names, slipping through countries like a ghost, gathering experiences without generating headlines. She developed genuine expertise in fields that had nothing to do with her inheritance. Art history became a passion, then a genuine scholarly pursuit. Architecture fascinated her, not just as beautiful objects to acquire, but as systems to understand and eventually create. Horticulture consumed years of study. She became expert enough to design gardens that would be preserved as cultural treasures. She studied jazz piano with serious musicians and became skilled enough to play professionally. She learned multiple languages with the fluency of someone who intended to use them. She was building a self that existed beyond her inheritance, an identity that could not be reduced to dollars, a person who had value beyond net worth. But she couldn't escape the fundamental problem that haunted all the heiresses of her generation, the question that no amount of expertise or privacy could answer. How do you know if someone loves you when you're worth $1 billion? How do you trust anyone when everyone might be calculating your value even as they claim to cherish your soul? Doris Duke's mother taught her to trust no one, a lesson that protected Doris from fortune hunters but also isolated her from genuine human connection. Was Nainalyn Duke protecting her daughter or programming her for loneliness? Where is the line between prudent caution and emotional abuse? And what would you have done differently if you were raising the richest child in America? Share your thoughts in the comments. It was at the home of friends in 1935 that Doris Duke first encountered the man who would become her first husband. A meeting that should have confirmed every warning her mother had ever given, every suspicion she had been trained to harbor. James Henry Roberts Cromwell, known to his friends and the society pages as Jimmy, was handsome in the way that made women overlook warning signs. He was charming with the practiced ease of someone who had been charming his way through life for decades. He was politically ambitious, his eyes fixed on diplomatic posts and perhaps higher offices. He was 15 years older than Doris, which might have suggested either maturity or predation depending on how generously one assessed his intentions. And he had already been married once before, to Delphine Dodge, heiress to the Dodge automobile fortune. That marriage had ended in divorce after Cromwell had enjoyed considerable access to Dodge resources and connections. The pattern should have been obvious. Here was a man who had already married one heiress and was now pursuing another, who had already demonstrated that wealthy women were his preferred romantic targets, who brought charm and ambition but no independent fortune to the table. But Doris, for all her intelligence and carefully cultivated skepticism, had the same blind spot that would destroy Barbara Hutton. She wanted to believe that someone could love her for herself. She wanted proof that her mother's paranoid teachings were wrong, that genuine connection was possible despite her fortune, that she was more than a bank balance in human form. They married on February 13, 1935, in a private ceremony that Doris attempted to keep secret from the press, a futile effort that demonstrated both her desire for privacy and the impossibility of achieving it. She was 22 years old enough to make her own decisions, but young enough that those decisions might be shaped by loneliness rather than wisdom. The marriage gave Doris something she hadn't anticipated, a political life that suited her temperament better than society parties ever had. Cromwell was appointed U.S. Minister to Canada, and Doris found herself playing diplomatic hostess, navigating political circles with intelligence and discretion. She discovered that she enjoyed the game of power, the careful conversations, the strategic relationships, the sense that she was participating in something larger than social calendar management. But there was a shadow over the marriage from its first days, a darkness that would reveal itself through tragedy rather than scandal, through loss rather than betrayal. And when that shadow finally emerged, it would transform Doris Duke into something harder, more guarded, more convinced than ever that love was a transaction she couldn't afford. But there was something that would haunt Doris Duke for the remaining 53 years of her life, something that happened in 1940, something that she rarely discussed publicly, but that shaped every decision she made about family, about children, about the possibility of genuine connection. Doris became pregnant. For a woman who had always been ambivalent about motherhood, fearing that her children would become targets just as she had been, that they would inherit not just her fortune but her isolation. This pregnancy was complicated from its first confirmation. She had seen what her wealth had done to her own childhood, had experienced firsthand the gilded prison that awaited any Duke heir. Did she want to subject another soul to that fate? But as the months progressed and her body changed, she began to embrace the possibility in ways that surprised even herself. Perhaps motherhood could be different for her children than it had been for her. Perhaps she could protect them from the worst of what she had experienced while giving them the love she had never received. Perhaps, finally, she would have someone who loved her without calculation, someone whose attachment preceded any understanding of net worth. The baby was born prematurely in July 1940. It was a girl, a daughter who would have inherited one of the largest fortunes in American history. She lived for only 24 hours. The official cause was listed as complications from premature birth, medical language that captured nothing of the devastation. But Doris believed, and would believe until her dying day, that her daughter could have been saved with better medical intervention, with faster decisions, with different care in those crucial hours. She blamed Cromwell for being absent during the crisis, for prioritizing something else when his daughter was fighting for her life. She blamed the doctors for delays she perceived as negligence, for not acting with the urgency that the situation demanded. She blamed herself for not insisting on different treatment, for trusting professionals who failed her, for whatever she might have done differently that could have changed the outcome. The loss transformed Doris Duke in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. She became harder, more guarded, more certain that the world would take everything she loved. She had finally found someone to love unconditionally, a daughter who had no interest in her fortune, who simply needed her mother, and that daughter had been taken from her before she could form a single memory. Doris would never have another child. She would never again allow herself that vulnerability. And within 3 years, she would divorce Cromwell, keeping her fortune intact but losing whatever softness, whatever openness, whatever capacity for trust had survived her childhood. That lost daughter was never publicly named. Doris rarely spoke of her, even to close friends. The grief was too private, too profound, too permanent for public consumption. But those who knew her well understood. Those 24 hours of motherhood and the lifetime of grief that followed explained almost everything about who Doris Duke became. The walls she built, the people she kept distant, the collections she amassed as substitutes for the connection she would never again risk. What happened after that loss would shape decades of Doris Duke's life, including a relationship that ended in death under circumstances that have never been fully explained, and a final chapter surrounded by controversy that investigators and journalists still debate today. But first, you need to understand the woman Doris became after 1940, why she surrounded herself with paid staff rather than family, with projects and collections rather than people, with walls so high that almost no one could climb them. In just a moment, you'll see the incident that would haunt her for 30 years, a death at the gates of her own mansion that some call accident and others call something far darker. And you'll see the circumstances of her own death, when the woman who trusted no one may have finally trusted the wrong person entirely. The decades following her divorce from Cromwell saw Doris Duke transform from reluctant heiress to deliberate eccentric, a woman who had tried conventional paths and found them all leading to loss, who now constructed a life on her own unusual terms. She married once more to Porfirio Rubirosa in 1947, the same Dominican playboy and professional charmer who would later extract millions from Barbara Hutton in their 53-day marriage. But unlike Barbara, who seemed determined to believe in each husband despite mounting evidence, Doris saw through Rubirosa's performance with relative speed. The marriage lasted barely a year before she extracted herself, her fortune largely intact, her cynicism about romantic love thoroughly confirmed. After Rubirosa, Doris largely abandoned the pursuit of traditional relationships. The lesson seemed clear. Marriage for her was a losing proposition. Men were either after her money or incapable of understanding the complications that came with it. Either way, the cost exceeded the benefit. Instead, she focused on collecting, transforming the acquisitive impulse that might have gone into acquiring husbands into something more tangible, more controllable, more satisfying. She collected art with the discrimination of a scholar and the resources of a nation. Her collection of Islamic art became one of the finest in private hands anywhere in the world, a treasury of calligraphy, ceramics, metalwork, and textiles that represented centuries of human creativity. She collected with genuine expertise, not merely signing checks for whatever dealers recommended, but studying, learning, developing the connoisseurship that distinguished true collectors from wealthy accumulators. She collected houses the way other people collected art, maintaining estates in New Jersey, Rhode Island, Hawaii, and Beverly Hills, each one reflecting a different aspect of her complex personality, each one providing refuge from the world she was escaping. She collected causes, funding medical research into conditions that had touched her life, supporting environmental conservation before it became fashionable, preserving historic buildings that might otherwise have fallen to developers. And critics noted with varying degrees of sympathy, she collected people, surrounding herself with paid companions, employees, and hangers-on whose presence in her life depended on her continued financial support. Whether this represented loneliness seeking connection or control seeking safety, observers could never quite determine. Her estate in Hawaii, Shangri-La, became her primary refuge from a world she had never quite trusted. Built in the 1930s in collaboration with architect Marion Sims Wyeth, it was an architectural masterpiece that combined Islamic design elements with Hawaiian setting, a palace of geometric tiles and ocean views, of careful symmetry and wild nature, of privacy so complete that Doris could finally be herself. Or at least the self she had constructed to survive. Whether that self was authentic or merely protective, even Doris might not have known. In the summer of 1966, at Rough Point, her estate in Newport, Rhode Island, Doris Duke made a decision that would end a man's life and generate questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Eduardo Tyerla was her longtime interior designer and companion, a man of genuine artistic talent who had worked with Doris for years, helping her restore properties and curate collections. According to those who observed their relationship, Tyerla was one of the few people Doris genuinely trusted, one of the rare individuals who had penetrated the walls she had built around herself. Their professional relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship. Perhaps the closest Doris came to genuine intimacy in her isolated later years. But Tyerla had recently delivered unwelcome news. He wanted to leave her employ. He had been offered a position in Hollywood as a set designer, a career opportunity that would launch him into film production, that would take him away from Doris's orbit and into a world where she could not control his presence. For a woman who had learned to hold everything and everyone at arm's length, the news of Tyerla's departure may have felt like yet another abandonment, another loss in a lifetime defined by losses. On October 7, 1966, Tyerla and Duke were at Rough Point preparing for her departure. The estate's heavy iron gates, massive barriers that protected the property from the outside world, needed to be opened for her car to pass through. According to Doris's account of what happened next, the sequence was simple. Tyerla got out of her station wagon to open those gates manually. Doris remained behind the wheel, waiting, and then something went wrong. What happened next has been debated for over 50 years, has generated books and investigations and conspiracy theories that continue to circulate. The car lurched forward. It struck Tyler with tremendous force. It dragged him across the gravel driveway, through the gates he had been opening, and across the road beyond the estate boundary. Eduardo Tyler was killed almost instantly, his body so damaged by the impact and dragging that identification required more than casual examination. Doris Duke told police it was an accident. Her foot slipped, she claimed. The car accelerated unexpectedly. She had tried to stop but couldn't. It was a tragedy, a horrible mistake, a malfunction of machine or body that had cost her trusted friend his life. The local police chief, a man whose department had received donations from Doris Duke, whose community depended significantly on the goodwill of its wealthy summer residents, ruled Eduardo Tyler's death an unfortunate accident within hours. No charges were filed. No grand jury was convened. The investigation, such as it was, concluded almost before it began. The investigation into Eduardo Tyler's death was cursory at best, perfunctory in ways that would be scandalous if applied to anyone without Doris Duke's resources and connections. Police spent minimal time at the scene, hours rather than the days such an investigation might typically require. The vehicle was never thoroughly examined by independent mechanical experts who might have determined whether the acceleration was genuinely accidental or something else entirely. Witnesses were not extensively interviewed. Their accounts were taken at face value rather than probed for inconsistencies. Within days, the case was closed with a finality that precluded any later reconsideration. But questions lingered, quiet at first, growing louder as years passed, and the protection afforded by Duke's wealth seemed more obviously purchased than earned. Why did the car accelerate so violently that it could strike a man, drag him through heavy iron gates, and continue across a road before finally stopping? How did a vehicle travel so far after the initial impact if the driver was genuinely attempting to brake? Why was Doris Duke, one of the richest women in America, whose case would normally attract intense scrutiny, allowed to leave the scene so quickly with so little documentation of her account? In 2017, investigative journalist Peter Lance obtained police records that had never been made public, documents that had been sealed or simply forgotten in the decades since Tyler's death. His examination of the evidence suggested what critics had suspected for 50 years. The original investigation had been influenced by Duke's wealth and her connections to the local power structure. Lance found inconsistencies between the physical evidence and the official account, details that didn't add up, explanations that didn't explain. Most significantly, he documented tire marks at the scene that suggested the car had not merely lurched forward in a momentary loss of control. The marks indicated sustained acceleration, the car speeding up over a significant distance, as if the driver was pressing the accelerator rather than desperately seeking the brake. As if the driver was not trying to stop. No charges were ever filed. The statute of limitations, whatever it might have been, had long since expired. Eduardo Tyler's family received a settlement from Duke's attorneys. The amount was never disclosed, sealed in agreements that prevented any public discussion of what had been paid or what it was meant to compensate. And Doris Duke never publicly discussed the incident again. Whatever truly happened at those gates, whether tragic accident or something darker, she carried the truth with her. She lived with that knowledge for the remaining 27 years of her life. Whether it was the weight of innocent guilt or guilty conscience, only she ever knew. Eduardo Tyler died at Doris Duke's gates, and the investigation was closed within days. 50 years later, journalists found evidence suggesting the original conclusion might have been wrong. But Doris Duke is long dead, and so are most witnesses. Does the truth still matter when everyone involved has passed? Is there value in investigating old injustices, or should some secrets stay buried? What do we owe to the dead and to the truth? Tell us in the comments. The final decade of Doris Duke's life was marked by increasing isolation, and by increasing dependence on a single individual whose influence would eventually consume everything she had spent 80 years protecting. Bernard Lafferty was an Irish-born butler who entered Duke's employment in 1987. He was flamboyant in a manner that seemed designed to entertain, devoted in a way that initially appeared touching, and according to many who observed his rise, deeply manipulative beneath the performance of service. He arrived at precisely the moment when Doris was most vulnerable. She was in her mid-70s, her health beginning its inevitable decline, her isolation nearly complete. The friends of her youth were dead or estranged. The employees who had served her for decades had retired or been dismissed. She was surrounded by paid staff whose loyalty extended precisely as far as their paychecks. And Bernard Lafferty understood, perhaps better than anyone, how to make himself seem indispensable to a woman who had never learned to trust but desperately needed to trust someone. Within years of his arrival, Lafferty had become the center of Doris Duke's daily existence. He accompanied her everywhere, to doctor's appointments, to business meetings, to the rare social engagements she still attended. He managed her medications, an increasingly complex regimen of painkillers and sedatives for various ailments. He controlled access to her, determining which old friends could visit and which were turned away with excuses. Former employees would later testify to patterns they found disturbing. They described watching Lafferty systematically isolate Doris from anyone who might challenge his influence. They testified that he encouraged her dependence on medications that clouded her judgment. They suggested that he positioned himself not merely as employee, but as the one person she could trust, even as he allegedly helped himself to funds, artwork, and influence that should never have been his. In 1993, Doris Duke was 80 years old. She had fallen and broken her hip, a catastrophic injury for someone her age, the kind of accident from which elderly patients often never recover. She was confined to her Beverly Hills estate, Falcon Lair, the former home of silent film star Rudolph Valentino. Her health was declining rapidly. She was under heavy medication, her famous intelligence clouded by chemicals and pain. And Bernard Lafferty was making plans that would become visible only after it was too late for anyone to stop them. What happened in the final weeks of Doris Duke's life has been investigated by lawyers, contested by her charitable foundation, and debated by journalists for 3 decades, and the questions have never been satisfactorily resolved. But the basic facts are damning enough on their face. A billionaire heiress, 80 years old and increasingly dependent on medication controlled by her butler, changed her will to make that same butler a primary beneficiary, and died shortly thereafter. In just a moment, you'll see the exact circumstances of Doris Duke's death, why her personal physician refused to sign the death certificate, what the autopsy revealed about the medication in her system, and why the man who controlled her final days walked away with millions. On October 28, 1993, Doris Duke passed away at Falcon Lair, her Beverly Hills estate. She was 80 years old, a lifespan that should have represented triumph over the isolation and loss that had defined her existence, that should have concluded with dignity befitting one of America's greatest fortunes. Instead, her death became a controversy that has never been resolved. The official cause of death was listed as pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs, a condition that can result from various underlying causes. But the circumstances surrounding her final days raised immediate questions among those who had known her, those who had observed Lafferty's increasing control, those who wondered whether the richest woman in America had been allowed to die, or worse. Duke's personal physician, Dr. Charles Kivovitz, took an extraordinary step. He refused to sign the death certificate. This was not a casual objection or a minor disagreement about medical terminology. A physician refusing to certify a patient's death is a serious matter, an implicit accusation that something about that death requires investigation. Dr. Kivovitz later testified to what had prompted his refusal. In Doris Duke's final weeks, he stated, she had received what he called inappropriate doses of morphine, levels of medication far exceeding what her physical condition actually required. The doses weren't merely generous. They were sufficient to suppress consciousness, to cloud judgment, to render a patient incapable of understanding documents placed before her or decisions made on her behalf. He expressed grave concerns about Bernard Lafferty's control over her medication schedule. The butler, not the physicians, seemed to determine when and how much medication Doris received. The butler, not the medical professionals, controlled access to the patient. The butler had become, in effect, the gatekeeper between Doris Duke and any care that might have extended her life or clarified her mind. An autopsy was performed, unusual for an 80-year-old woman dying of apparently natural causes, but the concerns were sufficient to warrant investigation. The results confirmed the presence of multiple drugs in her system, morphine, Demerol, and various sedatives in quantities that raised questions. The levels were consistent with someone being heavily medicated, possibly to the point of incapacitation, possibly to the point where consent to anything became meaningless. And then there was the matter of the will. Just weeks before her death, while she was recovering from a broken hip, while she was under the heavy medication that concerned her physicians, while Bernard Lafferty controlled virtually every aspect of her daily existence, Doris Duke had signed new estate documents. A new will, new trust arrangements, documents that would determine the fate of over $1 billion. These documents named Bernard Lafferty as co-executor of her estate, a position that came with extraordinary power and equally extraordinary compensation. As co-executor, Lafferty would receive a salary of $500,000 per year. He would share control over the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in America. He would have authority over assets, over distributions, over decisions that would affect institutions and causes for generations. The butler who had controlled her medications now controlled her legacy. The man who had isolated her from friends and family now stood to benefit from her death more than almost anyone else. Whether this outcome represented Doris Duke's genuine wishes, the final decisions of a woman who trusted Lafferty more than anyone else in her isolated world, or whether it represented something far more sinister, would become the subject of legal battles that consumed years and resolved nothing definitively. The aftermath of Doris Duke's death became a legal battlefield that exposed everything suspicious about her final years, while resolving almost nothing with certainty. Former employees came forward with allegations that confirmed the concerns observers had harbored for years. They described Bernard Lafferty as controlling beyond any normal butler's role, as manipulative in ways that seemed designed to increase Doris's dependence on him alone, as potentially abusive of the extraordinary position he had achieved. They testified that Lafferty had systematically isolated Doris from longtime friends and loyal staff, people who might have questioned his influence, who might have noticed changes in her mental state, who might have intervened before the final documents were signed. One by one, these potential witnesses had been removed from her life, fired or pushed out through manufactured conflicts, until Lafferty stood virtually alone between Doris and the outside world. They suggested that the will signed in those final weeks was executed when Doris Duke was not mentally competent to understand what she was signing, that the heavy medication, the recent injury, and the general decline of age had rendered her incapable of the informed consent that valid legal documents require. The surrogates court in New York launched a formal investigation. Lawyers representing Duke's distant relatives, family members who might have expected to inherit something from $1 billion estate, contested the will with every legal tool available. Medical experts were retained to debate whether the medication levels in Doris's system constituted appropriate treatment, medical negligence, or something that warranted criminal investigation. Bernard Lafferty maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, presenting himself not as a manipulator, but as a devoted friend. He described his relationship with Doris as one of genuine affection, the closest friendship of her isolated later years, the one person she truly trusted after a lifetime of learning to trust no one. He claimed that she had full mental capacity when she signed the documents that made him rich. He insisted that everything he had done was in her interest, on her instructions, according to her wishes. The investigation dragged on for years, consuming resources and attention while the fundamental questions remained unanswered. Had Doris Duke been exploited in her final years? Had her fortune, the same fortune that had isolated her throughout her life, finally made her vulnerable to the one person she trusted? In the end, a settlement was reached rather than a verdict rendered. Lafferty was removed as co-executor of the estate, stripped of the authority that had made him so powerful. He received a significant payment, millions of dollars, though the exact amount was never disclosed, in exchange for walking away from the position the disputed documents had given him. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation continued its work, its assets preserved for the causes Doris had supported throughout her life. No criminal charges were ever filed against Bernard Lafferty or anyone else. The questions about those final weeks remained questions, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. But the answers, if they existed, died with the people who knew them. Bernard Lafferty did not enjoy his inheritance for long, a conclusion that some observers interpreted as justice, and others saw as merely another chapter in a tragedy that consumed everyone it touched. After the settlement removed him from control of Duke's estate, Lafferty received several $1 million and retreated from the public scrutiny that had defined the years since Doris's death. He moved between properties, maintained the flamboyant lifestyle that had always characterized him, and spoke occasionally to journalists about his devotion to Miss Duke, always presenting himself as a faithful servant falsely accused, a grieving friend whose closeness to his employer had been twisted into something sinister by those who didn't understand their relationship. On July 4, 1996, less than 3 years after Doris Duke passed away, barely 2 years after the legal battles concluded, Bernard Lafferty was found dead in his Los Angeles home. He was 45 years old, decades younger than the woman whose final years he had dominated. The cause of death carried an eerie resonance with the questions that had surrounded Doris Duke's passing. Lafferty died from complications related to alcohol dependency and prescription medication, a combination of substances that had depressed his body's essential functions, that had proven fatal for a man in what should have been the prime of his life. The same categories of substances, sedatives, painkillers, the chemical tools of control or comfort depending on interpretation, that had clouded Doris Duke's final weeks had now claimed the man who had administered them. Some observers saw poetic justice in Lafferty's early death, a karmic accounting for whatever he had done or failed to do in Doris Duke's final years. Others saw evidence of a pattern, a man who had perhaps used substances to control his employer now consumed by those same substances himself. Still others saw simply another casualty of the Duke fortune, a man who had reached for the golden ring and discovered that holding it was more difficult than grasping it. Bernard Lafferty was buried in a simple ceremony that attracted almost no attention. The crowds of reporters who had documented the will contest, the photographers who had captured his every appearance at court hearings, the journalists who had speculated endlessly about his relationship with the richest woman in America, none of them appeared at his grave. Almost no one from Doris Duke's world attended. Whatever relationships he had built during his years in her orbit had not survived the controversy. Whatever affection anyone might have felt had been consumed by suspicion. He died as Doris had died, essentially alone, surrounded by substances rather than people, leaving behind questions that would never be answered. Doris Duke's charitable foundation continues to operate today, decades after her death, funding the causes she supported throughout her life with resources that still seem inexhaustible. Medical research receives grants that advance understanding of diseases she cared about. Environmental conservation projects protect lands and species that benefited from her attention. Child welfare programs continue work she began. The performing arts, her lifelong passion, receive support that nurtures new generations of artists. Her properties have been preserved as monuments to her eclectic vision and her genuine expertise. Shangri-La, her Hawaiian estate with its stunning collection of Islamic art, operates as a museum open to the public. The geometric tiles and carved screens that she collected over decades now visible to anyone who makes the journey. Rough Point, her Newport mansion with its heavy iron gates, those same gates where Eduardo Tyerla died, is open for tour, its art and furnishings available for visitors to appreciate. The name Doris Duke now represents philanthropy more than controversy, generosity more than suspicion. The foundation that bears her name has distributed hundreds of millions of dollars since her death, funding work that will continue long after everyone who knew her has passed. But the questions about her life and her death have never fully resolved. Was Eduardo Tyerla's death truly an accident, a tragic malfunction of machine or body at the worst possible moment? Or was it something else, something that wealth and influence ensured would never be properly investigated? Was Doris Duke exploited in her final years by a butler who recognized vulnerability and seized opportunity? Did she die under the influence of medications that clouded her judgment, surrounded by people whose interests conflicted with her own? Or did she simply, finally, trust someone, and have that trust prove warranted in ways that outsiders couldn't understand? Doris Duke proved something that the other heiresses of her generation also learned, each in her own way. That money provides protection from poverty, but not from loneliness. That you can build walls high enough to keep out fortune hunters, but those same walls will keep out everyone else too. That the isolation designed to protect becomes the isolation that destroys. She spent 80 years trying to figure out who she could trust. In the end, she may have trusted the wrong person entirely. Or she may have trusted the only person willing to stay, and the price of that staying was everything she had. Doris Duke's life ended in mystery, appropriate perhaps, for a woman who spent 8 decades hiding from a world that wanted nothing from her except her money. She had everything the world tells us should produce happiness: beauty that lasted into old age, intelligence that earned genuine respect, resources beyond imagination that could have purchased any experience, any object, any companion available for sale. But she had lost her father at 12, when she was old enough to understand exactly what protection was being taken from her. She had lost her only child at birth, in circumstances that haunted her until her final breath. She had lost faith in humanity somewhere in between, taught by her mother that everyone wanted something, taught by experience that her mother was usually right. The fortune that should have given her freedom instead became her prison. The privacy she cultivated to protect herself became the isolation that left her vulnerable. The control she exercised over every aspect of her world, her properties, her collections, her carefully managed existence, became the control that others would eventually exercise over her. The richest girl in the world died surrounded by paid staff, attended by a butler whose motivations remain questionable decades later, mourned by a public that had never truly known her because she had never allowed herself to be known. Perhaps that was what she wanted. Perhaps anonymity, even in death, was the final wall she built around herself, the ultimate protection against a world that had never seen her as anything more than a number followed by too many zeros. Or perhaps, like all the heiresses who came before her, she simply wanted to be loved for herself. And like all of them, she discovered that her fortune made that love impossible to verify, impossible to trust, impossible to believe. The gilded cage has many doors. Doris Duke spent 80 years searching for the one that led to freedom. She may never have found it. Speaking of women who became prisoners of their own fame, if you're finding these stories as compelling as we hope, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. We've got one more heiress to meet, Brenda Frazier, the glamour girl whose story might be the saddest of all. A woman who was manufactured for public consumption at 17 and spent 40 years trying to escape the photograph that made her famous. Now back to the gilded cage. In 1938, in the grand ballrooms of Manhattan, a new kind of celebrity was being born. A fame that had nothing to do with accomplishment, nothing to do with talent, nothing to do with anything except being beautiful, being wealthy, and being willing to be photographed. Not an actress performing a role, not a singer demonstrating skill, not a person of any particular achievement whatsoever. Just a beautiful girl from a moderately wealthy family, thrust into the spotlight by a mother with towering ambitions and a media machine hungry for glamour during the depths of the Great Depression. They called her Glamour Girl #1. They put her on the cover of Life magazine, the most influential publication in America, before she had done anything to warrant such attention except exist in the right circles at the right moment. They made her the most photographed woman in America, her face appearing in more newspapers and magazines than Hollywood stars who had spent decades perfecting their craft. Her name was Brenda Diana Duff Frazier. She was 17 years old when fame found her. She was 60 when she died, having spent 43 years trying to escape a single photograph taken when she was too young to understand what it would cost her. The fame that was supposed to launch her into happiness would instead destroy everything she had, including, eventually, herself. Brenda Diana Duff Frazier entered the world on June 9, 1921, in Montreal, Canada. Born into a family that possessed money, certainly, but not the kind of money that commanded headlines or opened doors that remained closed to ordinary Americans. Her father, Frank Duff Frazier, was a businessman of modest success, comfortable by most standards, wealthy enough to provide his family with advantages unavailable to the working class, but invisible in the rarefied circles where Vanderbilts and Astors and Dukes conducted their affairs. He was a man who worked for his living, who built something rather than inherited it, who would never have appeared in society pages except through his daughter's eventual notoriety. Her mother, Brenda Williams Frazier, known in society circles as Big Brenda to distinguish her from the daughter who would eclipse her entirely, was a woman whose frustrations would shape her child's fate more than any inheritance ever could. She was a society woman with ambitions that exceeded her circumstances, a social climber who had reached a certain altitude and found herself unable to ascend further, a woman who looked at the limits of her own life and saw in her daughter's future the achievements that had been denied to her. Unlike Gloria Vanderbilt's $5 million or Barbara Hutton's $50 million or Doris Duke's $100 million, the Frazier fortune was relatively modest, approximately $4 million, mostly held in trust for young Brenda. In the world of genuine Gilded Age heiresses, women whose names opened every door in America and Europe, Brenda Frazier was almost middle class, almost ordinary, almost invisible. But Brenda had something the other heiresses lacked, something that would prove more valuable in the emerging media landscape than any amount of inherited wealth. She had a mother who saw her as a project. Big Brenda looked at her beautiful daughter and perceived not a child to be nurtured, but an opportunity to be exploited. If she couldn't achieve social prominence herself, she would manufacture it through her daughter. If doors remained closed to Mrs. Frank Frazier, they would be torn from their hinges for the glamorous young Brenda Frazier, celebrity debutante. She would create a star. The fact that the star was her own child, and that stardom might destroy her, seems not to have entered into her calculations. Tragedy, or at least the kind of disruption that leaves permanent marks on children who experience it, struck Brenda's life early, establishing patterns of adult conflict that would define her existence. Her parents' marriage dissolved when Brenda was young, collapsing in the way that wealthy marriages often did, with lawyers and accusations, and a child caught between warring parties who seemed more interested in defeating each other than in protecting her. The divorce launched a custody battle that, while less sensational than Gloria Vanderbilt's courtroom crucible, followed disturbingly similar contours. Brenda was fought over, testified about, evaluated by strangers who would determine which parent she belonged to, and ultimately awarded to her mother. Frank Frazier largely disappeared from his daughter's life after the divorce, another father who found absence easier than presence, who retreated from the complications of shared custody into the simplicity of starting over elsewhere. Whatever relationship Brenda might have developed with her father, whatever balance his influence might have provided against her mother's consuming ambitions, vanished with the final court ruling. Big Brenda had won, and now she had complete control over her daughter's future, control she would exercise with the single-minded intensity of a general planning a campaign. That future was meticulously engineered from childhood forward. Brenda was sent to the finest schools that her family's fortune could access. Miss Porter's in Connecticut, the same institution where Barbara Hutton had learned the deportment expected of wealthy young women. She was given dancing lessons, deportment training, instruction in all the social graces that would be required of a debutante who intended to conquer New York society. Her education was less about developing her mind than about polishing her presentation, less about who she might become than about how she would appear. Her mother monitored her diet with obsessive attention, determined that Brenda would maintain the slender figure that photographed well, that met the beauty standards of the era, that would distinguish her from the plumper debutantes who would be her competition. Food became a battleground early, a pattern of restriction and control that would metastasize into something far more destructive as Brenda aged. Years later, Brenda would describe her childhood with the clarity of someone who had spent decades in therapy unpacking what had been done to her. She wrote, "I was never asked what I wanted. I was told what I would become, and I believed her, because what else did I know?" By the time Brenda reached 17, her mother's grand plan was ready to execute. The debutante season of 1938 would be Big Brenda's masterpiece, the culmination of years of preparation, the moment when all her careful cultivation would finally bear fruit. Her daughter would be the canvas, the media would be the brush, and whatever Brenda herself wanted, if she even knew what that might be, was irrelevant to the picture her mother intended to paint. At 17, Brenda Frazier made her debut into society, or rather, her mother made it for her, constructing a coming-out campaign that would have been recognizable to any modern publicity professional, but was revolutionary for 1938. The debutante season of that year was unlike any that had preceded it, a strange collision of old money ritual and emerging mass media, of Depression-era hardship and aristocratic excess. America was still struggling through economic catastrophe. Millions remained unemployed. Families continued losing homes. The bread lines that had defined the early 30s still stretched through city streets. And yet the wealthy elite continued their rituals of privilege as if nothing had changed, or perhaps because everything had changed, and tradition offered comfort against uncertainty. Coming-out parties cost tens of thousands of dollars, sums that would have fed families for years, spent in a single evening of champagne and orchestras and flowers imported from distant continents. Young women from old families were presented to society in elaborate galas, their eligibility for marriage announced to every fortune-seeking bachelor who might be interested. But Big Brenda understood something that the old guard, with their inherited money and inherited rituals, failed to grasp. The rules of prominence were changing. This was the age of mass media, of newsreels that reached millions, of picture magazines that shaped public opinion, of celebrity culture that was just beginning to emerge as a force that would eventually dominate American life. The most successful debutante of 1938 would not be the richest. The Fraziers couldn't compete on that terrain. She would not be the best connected. Old money families had networks the Fraziers couldn't penetrate. The most successful debutante would be the most visible, the most photographed, the most written about, the most famous. And so Big Brenda launched a publicity campaign with the sophistication of a Hollywood studio, promoting its newest star. She cultivated relationships with newspaper columnists, feeding them tidbits about her daughter's social calendar, her dress choices, her dance partners. She arranged photo opportunities with the care of a film director staging scenes, the right parties, the right lighting, the right angles that would make her daughter look luminous in black and white reproduction. She essentially invented the celebrity publicity machine that would later become standard practice for Hollywood stars and political candidates. But she invented it to promote a 17-year-old girl whose only qualification was being beautiful and available. The campaign worked beyond anything Big Brenda could have imagined. It worked so well that it would eventually destroy everything it touched. On December 6, 1938, Brenda Diana Duff Frazier appeared on the cover of Life magazine, and nothing about her existence would ever be the same again. This was not merely a significant achievement. It was unprecedented in American culture. Life magazine was the most influential publication in the nation, a picture magazine that reached into millions of households every week, that shaped opinions and created celebrities, that documented history as it happened. Its covers featured presidents making policy decisions, movie stars at the height of their fame, world leaders whose choices affected millions. The cover of Life was the summit of American celebrity, the confirmation that you mattered to the nation. And now it featured a 17-year-old girl whose only accomplishment was attending parties, a girl who had never acted in a film, never sung a song, never written a book, never done anything that might conventionally justify such prominence. The headline called her Glamour Girl #1. The accompanying article described her as the prototype of debutantes, the ideal against which all others would be measured, the standard of beauty and social success that every wealthy young woman should aspire to emulate. Overnight, Brenda Frazier became the most famous young woman in America, more recognizable than most movie stars, more discussed than most politicians, more visible than anyone who had ever achieved celebrity through mere wealth and beauty rather than actual achievement. The scale of her sudden fame would be staggering even by today's standards. She received over 5,000 fan letters per week, bags of mail from strangers across America who felt they knew her from photographs, who wanted her autograph, who sent proposals of marriage or friendship or simply adoration. Products were named after her without permission, her face and name attached to merchandise she had never endorsed. Songs were written about her by composers hoping to capitalize on her celebrity. She was mobbed in public like a movie star, crowds gathering wherever she appeared, photographers following her every movement. At 17 years old, Brenda Frazier had achieved a level of celebrity that would have satisfied most people for several lifetimes. But there was a cost accumulating beneath the flashbulbs, one that wouldn't become visible for years. Every photograph that made her famous also documented her transformation from person to product. Every headline that celebrated her beauty reminded her that she was valued for her appearance rather than her substance. Every crowd that gathered to catch a glimpse taught her that she existed not for herself, but for others' consumption. The flashbulbs that made her famous were also slowly recording her destruction. But behind the flashbulbs, behind the magazine covers and the society columns and the adoring crowds, something essential was breaking, cracking under pressure that no 17-year-old should have been asked to bear. Brenda Frazier was not enjoying her fame. She was enduring it, surviving each appearance, each photograph, each demand on her time and her image, without any sense that she was living her own life rather than performing in someone else's production. The constant pressure to be perfect, the right weight maintained through dietary restriction, the right dress selected from options her mother approved, the right smile held steady through hours of photography, was taking a physical toll that would worsen with each passing year. She developed severe anxiety that made public appearances ordeals rather than pleasures. She couldn't eat in public without feeling observed, judged, monitored for any deviation from the image that had been constructed around her. She began relying on medication to manage her nerves, the first steps on a path of dependency that would extend for decades. Her mother, far from recognizing the damage she was inflicting, only increased the pressure. Every appearance had to be flawless. Every photograph had to be stunning. Every moment in public had to reinforce the brand that Big Brenda had so carefully constructed. There was no acknowledgement that beneath the glamour was a frightened teenager who had never been asked what she actually wanted from her own life. Brenda later described the sensation with imagery that captured both the control and the powerlessness. "I felt like a puppet on strings that never stopped pulling." Someone else wrote her lines. Someone else chose her costumes. Someone else decided where she would appear and what she would say. She simply performed, night after night, the role that had been assigned to her. And there was something else the press never reported, something that the glamorous photographs concealed. The supposedly glamorous life was physically exhausting to the point of collapse. The parties went until dawn, and then there were breakfast appearances, and then fittings, and then more photographs. The social obligations were relentless. Every event required attendance, every invitation demanded response, every relationship required maintenance. Brenda was sleeping only a few hours per night, surviving on cigarettes and black coffee, her 17-year-old body pushed to limits that would have strained adults twice her age. She was already showing signs of burnout before she had legally become an adult, already displaying the symptoms that would eventually require hospitalization, already demonstrating that the pace of her manufactured celebrity was unsustainable. "I was manufactured," Brenda would write decades later, finally finding words for what had been done to her. "I was the product of my mother's ambitions and the press's appetite. I never had a chance to be real." The product was about to meet the market, and the man she was about to marry would prove that fame offered no protection, only new forms of exploitation. What happened next would take the glamour girl from the covers of magazines to the inside of hospitals, from the most celebrated debutante in American history to a cautionary tale whispered about at society parties. But first, you need to see the marriage that completed her destruction, the husband who made her controlling mother look kind by comparison, who took what remained of Brenda's independence and ground it to dust. In just a moment, you'll meet John "Shipwreck" Kelly, the man who turned Brenda Frazier from America's sweetheart into America's joke, and who proved that fame without substance is just a more visible form of vulnerability. In 1941, Brenda Frazier married John Sims Kelly, a former football star whose nickname, Shipwreck, referenced his fearless, reckless style of play on the field, and whose approach to marriage would prove equally destructive. Kelly was handsome in the way that attracted women before they understood what lay beneath the surface, charming with the practiced ease of an athlete accustomed to adulation, confident with the swagger of a man who had once been celebrated for physical prowess and had never developed anything else to recommend him. He was utterly wrong for Brenda, a poor match that should have been obvious to anyone who cared about her welfare. He was a former athlete who had never quite found a career after football, a man whose glory days were behind him before he turned 30, who had no profession, no prospects, and no evident skills beyond the charm that had always carried him through. He was also, according to accounts that emerged in later years, controlling in ways that went beyond mere jealousy, unfaithful almost from the beginning, and possibly physically abusive, though the full extent of what happened in their marriage remained hidden behind the discretion that wealth demanded. The press that had created Brenda now turned on her with equal enthusiasm. "Glamour girl marries gridiron hero," read the initial headlines, the fairy tale romance that the media always sought, but the mockery came quickly once the ceremony was concluded. Columnists nicknamed them the publicity couple, a label that suggested their marriage was more about generating headlines than about genuine connection, more about combining two fatting celebrities than about love. Others called Kelly a kept man, implying with varying degrees of subtlety that he had married Brenda for access to her trust fund rather than any interest in Brenda herself. The mockery was brutal in ways that would today generate discussions about media cruelty. Every public appearance was analyzed for evidence that the marriage was failing. Every photograph was examined for signs of unhappiness. The woman who had been celebrated for her glamour was now mocked for her choices, as if her fame had given the public ownership of her private decisions. And the mockery was just the beginning of what she would endure. The marriage was troubled almost immediately. Kelly spent freely, on clothes he couldn't otherwise afford, on cars that represented status he hadn't earned, on nightclub appearances that maintained a public profile he didn't deserve, while Brenda's trust fund slowly depleted to support his lifestyle. He was frequently absent from their home, and rumors of affairs followed him through New York society with persistence that suggested they were more than gossip. Meanwhile, Brenda's health continued the decline that had begun during her debutante season. She was hospitalized multiple times for what the newspapers of the era termed exhaustion, a euphemism that covered everything from nervous breakdown to medication dependency to the physical collapse of a body that had never been allowed to rest. They had a daughter together, Brenda Victoria, known as Vicky, in 1944. The child became the one bright spot in Brenda's increasingly dark existence, the one relationship untainted by calculation or exploitation, the one person who loved her without wanting anything except her presence. But even the joy of motherhood couldn't save a marriage that had been doomed from its first misguided moments. Brenda Frazier was manufactured into a celebrity before she was old enough to consent, then mocked by the same media that had created her when she made choices they didn't approve of. Today, we might recognize this pattern in child stars, influencer children, and young people thrust into fame by their parents' ambitions. Who is responsible when a child is exploited for fame? The parents who orchestrate it, the media that profits from it, or the public that consumes it? And what do we owe to young people whose childhood was stolen for our entertainment? Share your thoughts below. By the late 1940s, Brenda Frazier Kelly was disappearing from the public view that had once seemed inescapable, fading from the spotlight that had defined her since she was 17, retreating from a world that had consumed her youth and offered nothing sustainable in return. The glamour that had been her defining characteristic was fading with each passing year. At 17, she had been luminous, youth and careful presentation combining to create the image that had graced that Life magazine cover. At 25, at 28, at 30, she was still beautiful by any reasonable standard, but she was no longer new. The press that had celebrated her ascent now documented her aging with the same enthusiasm, comparing each new photograph to the ones from her debutante year, noting every wrinkle, every pound, every sign that the glamour girl was becoming merely mortal. She retreated to her home, finding in privacy the peace that public life had never provided. The parties that had once been her stage became obligations she avoided. The photographers who had once fought for her image now found themselves refused access. The woman who had received 5,000 fan letters per week now received none, because she had stopped being the person those fans had imagined. The constant publicity that had defined her youth had become a prison she desperately wanted to escape. Every time she appeared in public, the comparisons began again. Every photograph was measured against the 17-year-old who had seemed to represent perfection. She couldn't be herself, whoever that might have been, because the public expected the glamour girl, and the glamour girl existed only in old magazines. Her marriage to Kelly continued to deteriorate through cycles of separation and reconciliation that exhausted everyone involved. They separated, attempted reconciliation, separated again. Each cycle drained more resources, consumed more energy, left both parties more damaged than before. In 1956, after 15 years of mutual misery that had been inflicted on a daughter who witnessed all of it, they finally divorced. Brenda received custody of Vicky, but the victory felt hollow, achieved at the cost of most of her youth, most of her fortune, and most of her capacity for joy. Her money was largely depleted, consumed by Kelly's spending and the legal battles that had accompanied their long disintegration. Her health was destroyed by years of stress, of eating disorders that had become chronic, of medication dependency that had become physical necessity. Her fame had turned from asset to liability, a constant reminder of what she had been and what she had lost. She was 35 years old, She had already lived what felt like several lifetimes, and the worst somehow was not yet over. The decades that followed Brenda's divorce from Shipwreck Kelly were a long, slow fade, a gradual disappearance from a world that had never really seen her, only the image her mother had constructed. She married again in 1957 to Robert Chatfield Taylor, a stockbroker whose profession suggested stability, whose demeanor offered calm after the storms of her first marriage. This union was quieter, more private, less newsworthy by the standards of a press that had moved on to newer celebrities. It was perhaps the closest thing to a normal marriage that Brenda ever experienced. But normalcy couldn't undo decades of damage. It couldn't repair a psyche that had been bent since childhood to someone else's purposes. It couldn't cure the physical ailments that had accumulated through years of restriction and stress and chemical dependency. She struggled with medication dependency that had begun in her debutante years and had never been properly addressed. The pills that had helped her survive public appearances had become chains she couldn't break. She battled depression that seemed to have no bottom, that could lift for weeks or months before descending again with crushing weight. She rarely appeared in public, finding in seclusion the anonymity that fame had never permitted. In 1963, Brenda Frazier did something unprecedented, something that suggested she had finally found words for what had been done to her, finally discovered a way to transform her suffering into warning. She wrote a confession for Life magazine, the same publication that had crowned her Glamour Girl #1, exactly 25 years earlier, the same cover that had launched her into a celebrity she had never sought. The article was titled, "My Debut, a Horror," and in its pages, Brenda systematically dismantled every myth that had been constructed around her glamorous youth. She described the exhaustion that no photograph had captured, the sleepless nights, the constant appearances, the relentless pressure to perform. She detailed the exploitation that had begun with her mother and extended to every institution that had profited from her image. She named the eating disorders, the anxiety, the medication dependency that had been the hidden cost of her visible success. She warned young women not to follow her path, not to believe that fame was freedom, that attention was love, that being celebrated was the same as being valued. "I was a fad that lasted about half a minute," she wrote with bitter clarity. "I was the original glamour girl, and look at me now." The article created a sensation, the glamour girl admitting that glamour had been torture, the celebrity confessing that celebrity had been exploitation. But it didn't bring peace. It only confirmed what observers had suspected for years. The most famous debutante in American history had been miserable from the beginning. The confession was complete, but confessing, Brenda discovered, wasn't the same as healing. Brenda Frazier spent her final decades as a recluse, choosing invisibility with the same determination that her mother had once chosen visibility, embracing anonymity as the only escape from an image that had never represented who she actually was. She lived in Massachusetts, far from the Manhattan society that had created and consumed her, geographically distant from the ballrooms where she had once been paraded, from the photographers who had documented her every movement, from the world that had treated her as property rather than person. She saw few people outside her immediate family. She rarely left her home except for medical appointments that became increasingly frequent as her health declined. The contrast with her youth could not have been more complete. The woman who had been mobbed by crowds now cherished solitude. The girl who had received 5,000 letters per week now wanted nothing more than to be forgotten. The glamour girl had become a ghost, haunting a quiet house in New England, visible only to those she chose to admit. Her daughter Vicky remained close throughout these difficult years, one of the few genuine relationships that Brenda had ever experienced, untainted by the calculations that had characterized every other connection in her life. Vicky had grown up watching her mother's destruction, understanding perhaps better than anyone what fame had cost, what her grandmother's ambitions had stolen. She provided the consistent presence that Brenda had needed since childhood and had never received, the unconditional support that had been replaced, in her mother's generation, by conditional exploitation. Brenda's health continued the decline that had begun in her teenage years. The eating disorders that had started with her mother's dietary monitoring had become chronic conditions requiring medical management. The medication dependency that had begun with managing the anxiety of public appearances had become physical necessity. The psychological damage of being manufactured into a product had manifested in physical ailments that doctors could treat but never cure. She was hospitalized repeatedly in her final years, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated stress of 6 decades. The glamour girl who had dazzled photographers at 17 was now a frail woman in her 60s, largely forgotten by the world that had once celebrated her, remembered mainly in footnotes, and where are they now features that treated her as a curiosity rather than a cautionary tale. When journalists occasionally tracked her down for retrospective stories, seeking quotes from the former glamour girl, looking for updates on a life that had once generated constant coverage, Brenda's message was always the same. Don't do what I did. Don't let yourself be manufactured. Don't sacrifice yourself on the altar of publicity. No one listened. No one ever listens. The machinery that had consumed Brenda Frazier continued operating, finding new young women to celebrate and eventually discard, new faces to put on covers, new glamour girls to create and destroy. The pattern she had warned against continued without interruption. It continues still. Brenda Diana Duff Frazier passed away on May 3, 1982, in Boston, Massachusetts. She was 60 years old, not ancient by any standard, but aged beyond her years by decades of struggle that had begun when she was barely more than a child. The cause of death was listed as bone cancer, a disease that had been diagnosed years earlier and had slowly consumed her, that had added physical suffering to the psychological pain that had defined her existence. But those who had known her, those who had watched her decline, understood that Brenda had been dying for decades. The cancer was simply the final chapter of a destruction that had begun at 17, when a Life magazine cover had transformed a teenage girl into a product for public consumption. Her obituaries were respectful in the manner that obituaries for the once famous typically achieve, acknowledging her historical significance while struggling to explain why that significance mattered. Former glamour girl dies at 60, read the headlines, defining her in death exactly as she had been defined in life. By a title she had never chosen, by an image she had never controlled, by a fame that had stolen everything from her, including her own identity. The New York Times noted that she had been a symbol of the debutante era, as if being a symbol were an accomplishment rather than a burden. It mentioned that her 1963 confession had disenchanted a generation of would-be glamour girls, as if warning others about her destruction had been her primary contribution to American culture. But the obituaries, for all their respectful language, missed the larger point that Brenda herself had tried to make in that confession. In every interview she granted, in every warning she issued to young women who might follow her path. Brenda Frazier wasn't a cautionary tale about vanity or ambition, about a girl who wanted too much fame and got exactly what she deserved. She was a cautionary tale about what happens when a child becomes a product, when a young person's identity is manufactured for public consumption before she has any chance to discover who she actually might be. She was 17 when they put her on that magazine cover, 17 when the flashbulbs started, 17 when her mother's ambitions and the media's appetite combined to create a celebrity that benefited everyone except Brenda herself. She spent the next 43 years trying to recover from those flashbulbs, trying to find the person she might have been if no one had noticed her, trying to escape a photograph that followed her until her final breath. She never quite made it out. The glamour girl title was carved on her grave as surely as on any tombstone. She died still trying to escape what she had been at 17. Brenda Frazier's legacy is the warning she spent her final decades trying to issue, a warning that remains as relevant today as when she first articulated it, a warning that each generation ignores until the damage is done. She was, in many ways, the first modern celebrity victim, famous not for accomplishment but for image, consumed by a media machine that valued her appearance while discarding her humanity. Her story prefigured patterns that would repeat across the following decades. Princess Diana hounded by cameras until her final breath. Britney Spears collapsing under public scrutiny that treated her breakdown as entertainment. Countless child stars consumed by fame before they were old enough to understand what they were losing. The machinery of celebrity destruction that consumed Brenda has only become more efficient, more pervasive, more inescapable in the years since her death. Social media has replaced magazine covers, but the fundamental transaction remains unchanged. Young people are consumed for public entertainment. their images manufactured and distributed before they understand the cost. Her daughter Vicky survived her mother's fame and built a quieter life, perhaps the greatest legacy Brenda could have left, a demonstration that escape was possible if you refused to participate in the machinery. The Frazier fortune, what remained of it after decades of depletion, faded into obscurity with the name that had once commanded headlines. Brenda's confession, published in Life magazine in 1963, remains as relevant as the day she wrote it. Perhaps more relevant now, when the machinery she described operates at scale her generation couldn't have imagined. "I wasn't a person," she wrote in words that echo across decades. "I was a product, and products don't have feelings, products don't have futures, products just get used up and thrown away." She was describing her own experience, the transformation from girl to glamour girl, from human to commodity, from subject to object. But she was also describing something that would become increasingly common in American culture: the conversion of people into content, of individuals into images, of human beings into products designed for consumption. She was right about all of it. She was also, perhaps, the first person with sufficient visibility to articulate what that conversion cost, and what was lost when it was complete. Brenda Frazier's story differs from the other heiresses we've examined in ways that make her tragedy, in some respects, the most complete of all. Gloria Vanderbilt, Barbara Hutton, and Doris Duke were born into extraordinary wealth, fortunes so vast that the money itself became both shield and target. Their wealth attracted predators, isolated them from ordinary experience, and made genuine connection nearly impossible. But their money also provided resources: therapists to help process trauma, lawyers to protect their interests, options that ordinary people never possess. Brenda Frazier had money, but not that kind of money. What she had instead was something that would prove more destructive than any fortune: a mother who saw her as a project and a media culture that was learning how to manufacture celebrity from nothing more than a beautiful face and a willingness to be photographed. She was used by her mother, who transferred her own frustrated ambitions onto her daughter, by the press, which discovered that celebrating youth and beauty sold magazines, by a society that hungered for glamour during the Depression's darkest years, by everyone who profited from her image while contributing nothing to her well-being. And when they were done using her, when the novelty of her youth had faded and newer glamour girls had emerged, they discarded her, leaving her to manage decades of damage with resources that were never adequate to the task. "I was manufactured," she said. It was the truest thing she ever wrote, the most honest assessment of what had been done to her, the most accurate description of the process that had transformed her from person to product. She was also, perhaps, the most honest of all the heiresses, the only one who publicly admitted what the others knew privately: that the gilded life wasn't worth living, that the fame they had all experienced, whether sought or inflicted, came at costs that exceeded any benefit. That being valued for what you represented rather than who you actually were was a form of erasure that no amount of money or attention could compensate. The glamour girl died at 60, having spent 43 years trying to escape a photograph taken when she was 17. A photograph that captured her at her most beautiful and most exploited, her most celebrated and most victimized. She never quite made it out. None of them did. Brenda Frazier publicly confessed that her glamorous life had been misery, and still no one listened. We continue to manufacture young celebrities, consume their images, and express shock when they collapse under pressure we created. Why do we keep repeating this pattern? Is it possible to have celebrity culture without destroying the celebrities? Or is the destruction itself part of what we're consuming? We'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. 4 women, 4 fortunes. 4 gilded cages that glittered from the outside while imprisoning their occupants as surely as any penitentiary. Gloria Vanderbilt, $5 million in trust, a courtroom childhood that made her America's most famous victim, and 4 marriages before she finally found genuine love, only to lose it when her husband died, and then to lose a son in the most devastating way a mother can. She survived, ultimately. She built something of her own, but the price of that survival was paid across decades. Barbara Hutton, $50 million inherited at 21, 7 husbands who extracted her wealth while providing nothing in return, and a death at 66 in a hotel room with less than $4,000 to her name. She spent every penny trying to buy what had been stolen from her in childhood, and died having purchased nothing except loneliness. Doris Duke, $100 million from tobacco profits, a lost child who haunted her for 5 decades, a mysterious death at her mansion gates that was never properly investigated, and a final chapter shrouded in controversy that has never been resolved. She trusted almost no one her entire life, and when she finally trusted someone, it may have cost her everything. Brenda Frazier, $4 million and a mother who saw her as a project, manufactured into celebrity at 17 and discarded by 30, spending 40 years trying to escape a magazine cover that followed her to her grave. She warned us about what fame does to young people. We didn't listen. We never do. Combined, these 4 women inherited over $150 million in Depression-era currency, the equivalent of well over $2 billion today. Combined, they married 18 times, searching for love in arrangements that were structured from the beginning to fail. Combined, they proved something that should have been obvious but apparently wasn't, that each generation has to learn again at terrible cost. Money cannot buy love. Money cannot heal trauma. Money cannot fill the emptiness left by absent parents, lost children, or childhood stolen before they could begin. It can only make that emptiness more visible. It can only illuminate the void more clearly. It can only ensure that your suffering will be witnessed by millions who will treat it as entertainment rather than tragedy. We began this documentary by asking a question that seems simple until you try to answer it. How does infinite wealth lead to infinite misery? The answer, it turns out, is simpler and more devastating than expected. These women were never allowed to be children. They were never permitted the ordinary experiences of growing up, the privacy to make mistakes, the freedom to discover their own identities, the luxury of being valued for who they were rather than what they were worth. Gloria was a courtroom exhibit before she understood what courtrooms were, a child whose tears were photographed and published for public consumption. Barbara was a dollar sign from birth, a walking fortune who attracted predators before she could recognize them. Doris was a target from childhood, surrounded by walls that protected her from some dangers while guaranteeing isolation from any genuine connection. Brenda was a product manufactured by her own mother, a glamour girl created for public consumption before she had any chance to discover what she might have been if left alone. Before any of them could discover who they actually were, the world had already decided what they were worth. Before they could form genuine identities, identities had been constructed for them. Before they could choose their own paths, paths had been selected based on their fortunes rather than their preferences. And they spent the rest of their lives trying to prove that they were worth more than their bank accounts, or giving up and believing, finally, that they were worth even less. The poor little rich girl syndrome isn't really about money at all in the end. It's about being seen as property, being valued for what you have rather than who you are, being treated as an object rather than a subject, being consumed rather than known. Every person who married them for their money confirmed their worst fears about human nature. Every headline that reduced them to their fortune reinforced their isolation. Every fortune hunter who circled them proved that their mother's paranoia was justified, that trust was impossible, that love was always transactional, that they would never know whether anyone saw them at all. They were trapped, not by poverty but by wealth, not by obscurity but by fame, not by powerlessness, but by the weight of having more power than they knew how to use and more visibility than they could ever escape. The question that remains that we must ask ourselves is uncomfortable. Have we learned anything? Today's heiresses, the Hiltons and the Kardashians, the children of tech billionaires whose fortunes dwarf even the Vanderbilts, the Instagram influencers whose followings represent new forms of inherited visibility, face the same fundamental dynamics with different technological tools. Social media has replaced magazine covers, but the basic transaction remains identical. Reality television has replaced debutante balls, but the same machinery of exposure operates. The platforms have evolved. The exploitation continues. Brenda Frazier warned us in 1963, in a confession that should have changed everything, that manufactured fame destroys the people it creates. We didn't listen. The machinery she described has only become more efficient, more pervasive, more inescapable. Gloria Vanderbilt showed us that escape was possible, through work, through purpose, through refusing to let your inheritance define your identity. She built something of her own and found meaning beyond her fortune, but escaping requires resources that most people don't have. It requires opportunities that wealth ironically provides. And most people who enter the gilded cage don't find the exit. The cage is comfortable after all. Its bars are made of gold. The Jazz Age heiresses are gone now. Their fortunes have been dispersed or donated. Their mansions have become museums. Their photographs have yellowed in archives. But their story continues. Every time a wealthy child is photographed before they can consent, every time a family fortune becomes a family curse, every time someone inherits more money than love. The gilded cage has many doors, but none of them lead to freedom. They only lead to different rooms in the same prison, different forms of isolation, different varieties of loneliness, different ways of being seen by everyone while being known by no one. You've now witnessed how 4 of America's wealthiest women discovered that their fortunes were curses wrapped in gold, inheritances that promised everything and delivered only variations of the same isolation. But there's another side to this story, a side we've only glimpsed in passing, the men who married them. The marrying Mdevanis, who made careers out of seducing heiresses and extracting their fortunes. Porfirio Rubirosa, who married both Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton and walked away from each marriage with millions. The professional fortune hunters who circled these women from their first inheritance to their final breath, who could identify vulnerability across crowded ballrooms, who transformed seduction into a business model. Who were these men, really? How did they identify their targets? What techniques did they use to separate wealthy women from their fortunes? And what happened to them after the divorces were finalized, after the settlements were paid, after they moved on to their next victims? If you want to understand the other half of this equation, the predators who made the gilded cage even more dangerous, who proved that the money these women inherited also painted targets on their backs, we're working on that story now. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. These fortune hunters have stories that deserve examination and victims who deserve to be remembered. Until then, remember Gloria Vanderbilt's final words, spoken near the end of a life that had included more tragedy than any headline could capture. "I am not a poor little rich girl. I am a woman who made her own life." That's the only escape from the gilded cage. To build something that belongs to you, not to your family name. To earn what you have rather than inherit it. To be valued for what you create rather than what you possess. It's harder than it sounds. Most of the women in this documentary never managed it. But it remains the only way out, the only door in the gilded cage that actually leads to freedom rather than another room in the same prison. These 4 heiresses shared more than wealth. They shared the experience of being consumed by their own inheritances, of being valued for their fortunes while being ignored as human beings, of discovering that the money that was supposed to protect them became the precise mechanism of their destruction. If their stories moved you, outraged you, or made you think differently about wealth and happiness and the things we assume money can buy, share this documentary with someone who needs to hear it. These stories deserve to be remembered, not as gossip, but as warnings. And leave a comment telling us which heiress's story affected you most. Gloria's survival against impossible odds, Barbara's tragic decline from richest girl to lonely death, Doris's mysterious end and the questions that will never be answered, or Brenda's warning about what happens when we manufacture celebrities and discard them when we're finished. We read every comment, and your engagement helps us make more documentaries like this one. Investigations that go deeper than headlines, that treat their subjects as human beings rather than curiosities, that try to understand rather than merely judge. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for caring about these women as people rather than as symbols. And remember, the most valuable thing you can inherit isn't money. It isn't property. It isn't a famous name or a position in society. It's love given freely without transaction. Love that sees you as a person rather than a fortune. Love that remains when the money is gone. That's what these women spent their lives searching for. That's what most of them never found. And that's what no amount of money, not 5 million, not 50 million, not $100 million, could ever buy. We've spent 90 minutes with 4 women whose combined wealth exceeded $2 billion in today's currency, and who collectively demonstrated that money, far from solving problems, often creates them. They were isolated by their fortunes, exploited by those who claimed to love them, and reduced by the public to symbols rather than souls. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their stories is how easily we consume them as entertainment. How readily we treat their suffering as content, their tragedies as cautionary tales, their lives as material for documentaries like this one. Are we any different from the society columnists who documented Gloria's tears, the photographers who stalked Barbara through her marriages, the media that created Brenda and then mocked her decline? That's a question we can't answer for you, but it's worth asking, worth sitting with, as you click away from this video and return to a world where wealthy people's suffering still makes for compelling viewing, where we still consume celebrity drama without considering the human cost, where the gilded cage continues to trap new occupants while we watch from outside the bars. What do we owe to the people whose stories we consume? And what does it say about us that we consume them at all? Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. And thank you for remembering that behind every headline, there was a human being who deserved better than the story we told about them.